Welcome to Harry's Cosmos, where one turn of fate rewrites everything. Today's adventure: what if the Black family crowned Harry and Hermione king and queen? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1: The Rite of Blood. The motorbike came down through the rain over Godric's Hollow, and Sirius Black knew before his boots touched the lane that the house was wrong. Number 4 of the village had a hedge that James kept badly and a gate that whined on its hinge, and Sirius had landed on this exact patch of grass 100 times with fire whiskey in one pocket and some idiot present in the other. The gate was there, the hedge was there. The top floor of the house was gone, sheared open to the sky, the rafters cracked outward like a ribcage that something had climbed out of. Rain fell straight through the place where Harry's nursery had been. He left the bike where it dropped. He did not remember crossing the garden. The front door hung off one hinge, and the hall smelled of cold ash and a sweetness underneath it that his body recognized before his mind would. James lay at the foot of the stairs with his glasses knocked askew and his wand 3 feet from his open hand, and his face was turned toward the door, toward the sound of a friend who had come too late. He had gone down with nothing in his fingers. He had put himself between the door and the stairs, and he had not even had time to reach his wand, and Sirius understood the whole shape of the night from that one detail, and the understanding put him on his knees on the floorboards. He stayed there longer than he would ever afterward admit. Rain ticked against what was left of the roof. Somewhere above him, faint and furious and entirely alive, a baby was screaming. That sound got him up. He took the stairs 3 at a time, past the scorch marks blooming up the wallpaper, past the door blown off its frame, into a room with no ceiling and one wall down to the laths. Lily was there. He did not look at her long, because if he looked at her long he would not be able to do the thing he had to do, and the thing he had to do was standing up in the wreck of a cot with both fists in the air, red in the face, roaring at the broken world with the lung power of the Potter line entire. "All right," Sirius said. His voice came out cracked. All right, I've got you, pup." He lifted Harry out of the cot and the small body went rigid and then collapsed into him, fists knotting in his collar, the screaming dropping all at once to a wet, hiccuping mutter against his neck. There was a cut on the child's forehead, high over the right eye, a clean split shaped like a stroke of lightning, still beating. It had stopped bleeding hard. Sirius pressed his sleeve to it anyway and felt the heat come off it, a heat that had nothing to do with fever, a low, ugly pulse that made the hair stand up along his arms. He had been a Black for 22 years before he learned to stop being one. He knew the feel of bad magic. This was the worst he had touched, and it was sitting in the skin of a 15-month-old who had just grabbed his thumb and would not let go. "Where is he?" Sirius said to the room, to Lily, to nobody. "Where did he go?" "There's no body, Lily, there's no body." The cold green light that had been in this room was gone, but its absence had a shape, a hollow burned into the ordinary dark, and standing in the middle of that hollow Sirius felt the first thread of the old instinct, the family one, the thing he had spent his whole life trying to drown. Somewhere a thing had come apart that should not have come apart. The night had a seam in it. Harry sneezed and the lightning cut on his forehead flared, and from 3 counties away, in a black house with a black door, an ancient tapestry shivered as if a wind had crossed it that no window had let in. Hagrid arrived as Sirius carried the baby out into the garden, and Hagrid was crying so hard he could barely speak, and what he did say tore the next hour into a shape Sirius had not been ready for. "Dumbledore's orders," Hagrid kept saying, scrubbing at his face with a tablecloth-sized handkerchief. "I'm ter bring I am Sirius. I'm ter bring Harry ter Dumbledore, and Dumbledore says he's ter go ter his aunt, his mum's sister, be safe there, see, blood protection, professor's got it all worked out." His aunt. Sirius did not raise his voice. He had learned, in a childhood spent learning exactly this, that the quietest voice in the room is the one people should be afraid of. Petunia Dursley, Lily's sister, who sent back the wedding invitation in pieces, who calls our world a sickness. "You want to give James and Lily's son to her." "I don't want anything," Hagrid said helplessly. "It's the professor. He says it's safest. He says there's protection in the blood, Lily's blood, the sister, and he'll grow up away from all of it, no fuss, no fame, juice ordinary, till he's old enough ter whatever it is the professor's got planned for him." Old enough. Sirius shifted Harry higher on his shoulder. The child had gone quiet, watching Hagrid with the wet-eyed solemnity of the very small, one fist still locked in Sirius's collar. Old enough for what, Hagrid? To be useful. Hagrid had no answer for that, because Hagrid was the best man Sirius knew and the worst liar, and the truth was sitting on his big honest face plain as a signpost. He did not know what came after old enough, and he had never thought to ask. It would have been very easy then. Sirius could feel how easy it would have been. "Hand the baby over. Go and find Peter, find that sniveling little traitor and his pointing finger, and do the thing that every cell in his body was screaming to do." He had even started earlier before the bike. He had stood over James in the hall with murder laid out in front of him like a clean table, and the only reason he had got back on the motorbike instead was that the baby upstairs had still been screaming, and a screaming baby is a thing you go to. That was the hinge of it, though he would not understand it for years. The whole rest of his life turned on the fact that he had gone to the crying child instead of the running rat. Peter could wait. Peter would always be a coward in Coward's Keep. The thing in his arms could not wait, because somewhere a man with cold orders and the kindest face in Britain had already decided where this child belonged, and Sirius Black had spent his entire youth being told where he belonged by people who loved him and were wrong. "No," he said, "he doesn't go to the Dursleys, he doesn't go to Dumbledore, he comes home with me. Sirius, he comes home," Sirius said to his family. And he meant the Potters. In his heart he meant the Potters, but the word that came out of his mouth was a black word, and the moment he said it something answered. Far off in a house he had run away from at 16, a door he had sworn never to walk through again opened of its own accord, and an old woman who had been awake for 3 nights running lifted her head from a book of names and said to the empty hall, "There, at last, there you are." They came for him before dawn, which told Sirius everything about how the night had been read in 2 directions at once. He had taken Harry to the only place he could think of that was warded in his own, a cottage on the Devon coast that the Potters kept for summers, and he had got a fire going and the child asleep in the crook of his arm when the wards rang. Not the angry clamor of an attack, a formal sound, a knock made of magic, courteous and absolute, the sound of someone who had every right to be at your door and wanted you to know they knew it. He opened it with his wand in his hand and the baby against his chest, and on the step stood Arcturus Black. Sirius had not seen his grandfather in 6 years. The old man had not shrunk the way the very old are supposed to. He stood under a black umbrella that the rain did not seem to be touching, in a coat that had been fashionable around the time of the Crimean War and had never once gone out of fashion in the only circles Arcturus cared about, and his eyes were the gray of the family, the gray of a sea with weather coming, and they went straight past Sirius to the child. "You called the house," Arcturus said. "Did you mean to?" "I didn't call anything." "You said the word home," said the old man, "with a Potter air in your arms and black blood in your mouth, on a night when the Dark Lord has come undone over that infant's cradle. You called the house Sirius, whether you meant to or not. The tapestry has redrawn itself. I felt it in my teeth." He tilted his head a fraction. "May I come in? It is raining, and I am older than the rain." Behind Arcturus, at the foot of the path, 2 more figures waited. One was tall and straight-backed and silver-haired, and held herself like a sword that had been put away wet and never forgiven the world for it. The other was slighter, hooded, hanging back at the edge of the warding with the posture of a man who was not sure he was allowed inside any decent house ever again. Sirius knew them both, Great Aunt Cassiopeia, who had taught him to hold a wand before he could hold a spoon, and half in shadow, impossibly, his brother. "Regulus is dead," Sirius said. It came out flat. "Regulus died 2 years ago," Creature said. Creature said what he was ordered to say. Cassiopeia answered from the path in the dry, carrying voice that had terrorized 3 generations of blacks. "Move aside, child. You are letting the warmth out, and your brother has been colder than you can imagine for a very long time." He let them in. He could not have said why, except that the baby had woken and was looking at the old man on the step with that same wet solemnity, and Arcturus Black, who had disowned his own grandson with a stroke of a quill and never once written to take it back, was looking at the baby the way a man looks at water after a long crossing of sand. They sat in the Potters' summer cottage, which had never in its history held a single black and now held 4 of them in an heir, and Cassiopeia took the child onto her lap without asking and turned his face to the firelight to read the cut on his brow. "Curse Scar," she said. "Killing curse, he should be dead, he is not." Her thumb hovered over the lightning mark without touching it. The curse went into him and did not take. It went into him and came back out and took the caster instead, which is a thing I have read of exactly once in a book that the ministry burned and we did not. She looked up and her sea-gray eyes found Sirius across the room. "Do you know what your friend's wife did the night she died?" "She died," Sirius said. "That's what she did. She got in front of him and she wouldn't move and Voldemort killed her." "She made a covenant," Cassiopeia said, "a small one, the oldest kind. A life freely laid down over a thing beloved, with the right words or no words at all, only the right blood and the right will. It is the root from which every great binding in our history grew, and it is the root of the one this house has been waiting 900 years to see flower again." She turned the baby gently so the firelight crossed the scar a second time, and the mark answered the light with a low red glow that was not reflection. And it took. "Look at him, Arcturus. Look at what the curse left behind when it failed. The land knows him. The wards of this little house lean toward him. He has been here 4 hours and already the place wants to belong to him." Arcturus did not sit. He stood by the cold window with his hands folded on the head of a cane he plainly did not need, and he watched the baby, and when he spoke his voice had lost the courtroom dryness it had worn on the step. "Lily Evans," he said, "Muggle-born, so the ministry's register reads." "The ministry's register," said Cassiopeia, "is a list of who paid attention and who did not." She stroked the baby's hair back from the scar. "I traced the Evans line a year ago when this child was born and the house first stirred in its sleep. I told no one because I did not believe it, and a black who tells a thing she does not believe is a black who gets people killed. There's a name 4 generations up the Evans tree that the Muggles spelled wrong and forgot, and it is not a Muggle name." It is a name out of the cadet branch of the old Sun line, gone to ground after the sundering, gone squib, gone quiet, gone for 3 centuries into the Muggle dark where no one would ever look for a king. Her hand stilled. And then a witch named Lily was born to it, magic come back up out of the deep like a spring after a drought, and she married a potter, which is to say she married the only other house in Britain that still carries the Peveril thread unbroken, and she had this child, and then she laid her life down over him in the oldest binding there is. She looked at the baby, who had fallen asleep against her with his fist around her finger. The blood has come back to us, Arcturus, after 900 years. It is asleep in my lap with someone else's nose. For a long moment the only sound was the fire and the rain. It was Regulus who broke it. He had not pushed his hood back. He spoke from the shadow by the door, and his voice was wrecked and quiet and very young. "Then we cannot let Dumbledore have him," Regulus said. "Whatever else is true, whatever I have done, and I have done a great deal, we cannot let that man raise a king." Sirius looked at his brother, the brother he had buried in his own mind 2 years before, and 100 questions stacked up behind his teeth, and he asked none of them because Arcturus had turned from the window, and when the lord of an ancient house turns from a window, the room turns with him. "No," Arcturus agreed, "we cannot, which is why at first light we are going to do a thing this family has not done since before the ministry had a name. We are going to claim him by the right of blood which predates their courts and outranks their wards, and we are going to do it in front of Albus Dumbledore so that he understands from the very first hour exactly whose hands the child has fallen into." Dumbledore came to them in the end, which Sirius would remember as the single most telling thing about the whole affair. They had braced for a fight, a chase, a war of injunctions. Instead, at 9 in the morning, with the rain finally stopped and a thin gold sun lying along the Devon cliffs, the wards rang their courteous bell a second time, and there he stood, long silver beard, half-moon spectacles, robes the color of a kingfisher, hands folded, smiling, alone. "Sirius," said Dumbledore warmly, "my dear boy, I have been so worried." "Have you?" Sirius said. "Hagrid came to me in a dreadful state. He felt he had failed me. I told him he had done nothing of the kind, that you were Harry's godfather, and there was no safer place in Britain for a frightened man to carry a frightened child than into your arms." Dumbledore's eyes moved past Sirius into the warm room and found the others, and his smile did not falter by a single degree, which was itself a kind of falter. "Arcturus, Cassiopeia." And the blue eyes touched the hooded figure by the door and rested there 1 instant longer than was comfortable, and a guest I had not expected. How the House of Black does keep its surprises. "Come in, Albus," said Arcturus, "and stop standing on my grandson's doorstep like a man selling cauldron polish. We have a great deal to settle and very little mourning to settle it in." Dumbledore came in. He took the chair offered him, accepted tea he did not drink, and folded his hands over the head of his own staff, and Sirius, who had spent his school years believing in this man without reserve and his adult years half suspecting him, watched the warmth on the old wizard's face and could not find the place where it stopped being real. That was the thing about Dumbledore. The kindness was not a mask. It went all the way down. It was just that under the kindness all the way down there was something else as well, a thing with its own purposes, and the kindness served it. "You wish to keep Harry," Dumbledore said gently. "Of course you do. You loved his father like a brother, but Sirius, I must ask you to hear me, because I have not chosen Petunia Dursley out of cruelty or convenience. Lily's sacrifice laid a protection in her blood. While Harry can call the home where his mother's blood dwells his own, no servant of Voldemort can touch him there. Petunia carries that blood. It is the surest shield I can give him, and the surest shield is what a hunted child needs, whatever it costs in comfort. He would be safe there. He would be ordinary there. He would grow up out of the long shadow that fame and prophecy will otherwise cast over every single day of his life." He spread his hands. "I want to give him a childhood, that is all. A plain, dull, loving, unremarkable childhood, far from people who would use him." It was, Sirius thought, a very good speech. It was nearly true. It was true enough that if he had heard it alone with no one beside him, he might have believed it and handed the baby over and spent the rest of his life telling himself it had been right. But Cassiopeia laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a very old woman who has heard a very old lie wearing a new coat, and it cut the warmth in the room clean in half. "A protection in the blood," she said. "Oh, Albus, you always did pick the true thing and bend it. Yes, the mother's sacrifice laid a covenant, and yes, it lives in the blood, and yes, it could be anchored to a home." She leaned forward over the sleeping child. "And you would anchor a binding of the oldest royal kind, the most precious thing to wake in this land since the crown went dark, to the spare bedroom of a Muggle grocery clerk who hates us, and let it sit there gathering dust and resentment for 11 years, untaught, unread, untended, until the day you decided you had a use for it. You would take a spring of living royal magic, and you would cap it with a stone and call the capping protection." Her sea-gray eyes did not leave his face. "You know what he is, Albus. You felt the land turn last night the same as I did. You came here this morning not because Hagrid worried, but because you wished to see for yourself whether the rumor your own instruments were screaming at you could possibly be true. And it is true. and so you will forgive an old woman for declining to hand the heir of Albion to the one man in Britain with the cleverness to raise him into a tool and the conviction to believe he was doing it for love. The room was very quiet. Harry slept on. Dumbledore looked at Cassiopeia for a long moment, and the warmth was still on his face, but behind the half-moon glasses something had gone still and watchful and old, and Sirius understood that he was, at last, seeing the thing under the kindness look out. "You believe the crown can be restored," Dumbledore said softly. "You always have. Your whole house has nursed that hope like a lamp in a crypt for 9 centuries. And I am telling you, Cassiopeia, as one who has read the same histories you have, and a great many you were never permitted, that the last time a sovereign pair sat the throne of Albion, the binding turned in their hands and broke them, and the sundering that followed nearly took our entire people down into the dark with it. The throne is not a gift. It is a wound that has not been allowed to heal, and you would tear it open and pour a child into it." He turned his gaze on Sirius, and now the kindness was aimed like a wand. "Sirius, you are not a man who wants a crown for anyone. You ran from this family precisely because it makes crowns out of children. Think, whatever they have told you in one night, think what it means for Harry to be raised toward a throne instead of away from one. Give him to me and he will be a boy. Keep him here and he will be a claim." And that, Sirius would think afterward, was the cleverest thing the old man said, because it was aimed exactly where Sirius was softest, and it was nearly right, and for the space of 3 heartbeats he wavered. Then Harry woke up. The baby stirred in Cassiopeia's lap, blinked at the bright kingfisher blue of Dumbledore's robes, reached one fat hand toward the color, and made a sound of pure uncomplicated wanting. And Sirius looked at that hand, and he thought of James putting himself between the door and the stairs with no time to reach his wand, and he thought of Lily laying her life down over this exact child with the right blood and the right will, and he found that the wavering was gone and something harder had grown in its place. "James and Lily made me his godfather," Sirius said, "and they made me promise, both of them, separately, that if it ever came to it I would raise him as if he were my own son. Not as a boy you could keep dull and safe in a cupboard until you wanted him. Not as a claim my family could sharpen for 9 more centuries. As my son. So here's what's going to happen, Albus. We are going to raise him, all of us. This whole mad, terrible family is going to raise this child, and we are going to teach him every single thing about what he is, the whole truth, the throne and the danger and the sundering and all of it, so that when he is a man he can decide for himself what to do with it. Not be told, decide, and you are going to go home to your school, and you are going to be his headmaster one day, and on that day you will find that the child you wanted to keep ignorant knows precisely who he is and precisely who you are." He came and stood over Cassiopeia's chair, over the child, a guard at a small gate. "By the right of blood I name Harry James Potter, Ward of the House of Black, under my hand as his godfather and under my grandfather as Lord of the House. Witnessed and sealed. Try and take him, and you take him from all of us at once." He had not known he was going to say the formula. It rose up out of him from somewhere below memory, the old words a black child learns the way other children learn nursery rhymes, and the moment they left his mouth the cottage answered. The fire flared white and went blue and steadied. A weight settled over the room, an old weight, a claim laid down and locked. And on the wall above the mantel, in a frame that had held a Potter holiday photograph an hour before, a thread of silver light traced itself into being and resolved, slowly, into a coat of arms that no one in the room had hung. The ravens and the stars and the motto in letters of grey fire, TOUJOURSPUR. Arcturus Black exhaled very slowly, like a man laying down a thing he had carried for 50 years. "Witnessed," he said, "and sealed." Dumbledore rose. He looked at the arms burning on the wall, and at the baby reaching for the blue of his robes, and at the 4 blacks ranged around the child like the points of a compass, and whatever calculation went on behind the half-moon glasses, it ran fast and came out in the end on the side of patience. "Then I will not contest it," he said. "Today." He inclined his head, courteous to the last. "You will forgive me if I do not pretend to be easy in my mind. I have buried a great many people who were certain they could control a power older than themselves, Arcturus. I should not like to bury this child among them." He moved to the door, and there he paused, and he looked back, and for one moment the kindness on his face went so deep and carried such a weight beneath it that Sirius almost called him back. "Love him," Dumbledore said, "whatever else you do with him. If you do nothing else right, love him, and it may yet be enough to save you all from what you are about to begin." And he was gone between one blink and the next, in the way of very great wizards who do not care to be watched leaving. The arms on the wall burned a moment longer, then faded back into a photograph of James and Lily laughing on a beach, frozen and waving and dead. "Well," said Sirius into the silence. His voice did not hold. "Well." Cassiopeia stood with the baby and crossed to him and put Harry into his arms with a care that her face refused to admit to, and for one moment the fierce old woman's hand rested against the back of Sirius's neck, the way it had when he was 4, and the portraits along the gallery would not stop their whispering. "You did well," she said quietly. "Your mother would be furious. I am proud of you. Now sit down before you fall down, Lord Blacksair, and let us go home and begin." Selim Hall stood on a fold of moor in the Welsh marches, where the ley lines crossed, and it had stood there in one form or another since before the marches were marches. It was not the grim London house on Grimmauld Place, which Sirius hated and would always hate. It was older and stranger, and in its severe grey way beautiful, a long hall of pale stone with windows like cut gems, set in a garden that grew things no garden in Britain had any business growing, under a sky that always seemed to hold more stars than the sky over anywhere else. The Blacks had named themselves for stars, and they had built their true seat under the clearest stars in Britain, and when Sirius carried Harry across the threshold for the first time, the whole house drew a breath. He felt it, they all felt it. The lamps came up of their own accord. The great hearth in the hall, cold for years, woke with a sound like a sigh. And along the upper gallery, where the family's history hung in oils and silver thread, the portraits turned in their frames, one after another down the centuries, ancestors waking from the long boredom of the dead to look at the child in the doorway, and a murmur ran from frame to frame. The same two words passed hand to hand down 900 years of Blacks. At last, at last, at last. They have been waiting, Regulus said. He had finally put back his hood, and in the lamplight his face was Sirius's own face, worn thin by something terrible, hollow at the cheek, old at the eyes, 21 years old and 100. All my life I thought the waiting was a story, a thing the old ones said to make us feel important. Towger's purr, always pure, keep the blood, marry the cousins, the king will come. I thought it was bigotry dressed up as destiny. He looked at the baby. I went to Voldemort partly because of it. Because if it was all just blood, pride, and waiting, then here at last was someone doing something, acting, building. I was such a fool. His voice cracked. Sirius, I have to tell you what I did. I have to tell all of you. Because if that child is what Cassiopeia says he is, then what I learned in the Dark Lord's service is the most important thing in this house, and I have been too much of a coward to say it for 2 years. Then say it, Sirius said. He did not go to his brother. He did not know how yet, but he did not look away, and for Regulus that seemed to be enough. Not tonight, Cassiopeia said, before Regulus could begin. She had crossed to the great hearth and stood with her back to it, and the firelight turned her silver hair to a crown. Tonight is not for the dark thing. Tonight a child has come home to this house for the first time in 900 years, and we will do this one thing right before we do all the terrible things we will have to do. Regulus, your confession will keep until morning. The dead can wait one more night. The living cannot. She held out her arms. Give him to me. Sirius gave Harry to her, and Cassiopeia carried the baby the length of the hall under the waking portraits to the foot of the great staircase where a single tall window held the whole western sky. She lifted him so the starlight fell across his face, across the lightning cut on his brow, and the cut answered the stars the way it had answered the fire, a low red coal among all that cold white light. House of Black, Cassiopeia said, and her dry voice filled the hall, and the portraits fell silent to hear it. Hear me. I am Cassiopeia, daughter of Sirius, daughter of Phineas, keeper of the oath we swore when the crown went dark and the throne went empty and we were left the last sworn shield of a king who never came. For 900 years we have kept faith in a thing the whole world called a children's tale. We have been hated for it and have hated ourselves for it and have done dark and foolish things in its name, and tonight the faith is rewarded. The blood of the Sun line has come back to Britain. It is in this child. I have read it in his scar and in the turning of the land and in the waking of this hall, and I stake my name and my long life upon it. She turned slowly so every portrait in the gallery could see the baby's face. He is not ours to use, mark that, all of you living and dead. He is not a tool, not a claim, not a weapon for this house to wield against its enemies. He is a king to be raised, and our oath is the same as it ever was, to shield him, to teach him, to set the crown in his hand when he is grown, and then to kneel. Not before. We do not crown children, we raise them. Towger's purr. Her voice gentled, and she brought the baby down out of the starlight and held him against her, an old woman and a sleeping child. Always faithful, that is what it meant before the small minds got hold of it. Always faithful to the line. We have kept the faith. Now we keep the child, and the House of Black, all of it, the living in the hall and the dead in their frames, made the old answer. A sound like wind through a long gallery, like the sea heard from very far inland. We keep the child. Harry slept through every word of it, which was Sirius thought, exactly as it should be. Later, when the others had gone to their wings and the great hall had banked its fire, Sirius sat in a window seat with the baby and watched the moor go silver under the moon. Andromeda had come near midnight with little Nymphadora asleep on her shoulder and Ted yawning in the doorway, and she had wept over Harry and over Sirius, and then, being Andromeda, had organized everything. Which room, which nurse from the village would be trusted, which of Harry's mother's habits Sirius had better learn fast or regret. She had a way of turning the worst night of their lives into a list of useful tasks, and Sirius could not have imitated it to save his life. She had brought a christening gown that had been Nymphadora-s, and a recipe for the warm milk that Lily had used, copied out in her own hand from a letter Lily had sent her in another life, and she had pinned it to the kitchen wall without a word and gone about boiling the milk. She had gone up an hour ago. The hall was his and the baby's. Right, Sirius said softly to the sleeping child. Here's the situation, pup. I'm rubbish at this. I want you to know that going in so you can't say later you weren't warned. I've never raised anything. I had a houseplant at school and Remus had to take it because I forgot it existed. I am 22 years old and I have lost the two best people I ever knew in one night, and I am sitting in the house I ran away from holding a king, and I have no idea none what I'm doing. He smoothed the dark hair so like James S. away from the scar. But I'll tell you what I do know. I know your dad. I knew your dad better than I knew myself, and he didn't want a crown for you, and your mum didn't want a crown for you. Your mum wanted you to be happy and clever and kind. That was the whole list. I heard her say it. So whatever this house wants, whatever destiny that mad, wonderful old woman just sang at the portraits, here's my promise, and it's the one that counts because I'm the one who's actually going to be up at 3 in the morning with you. You get to be a kid first. You get to be Harry first. The king part can wait until you're tall enough to argue about it. He pressed his lips to the warm dark hair. I've got you, and I'm not Dumbledore, and I'm not my mother, and I'm not going to raise you into anybody's tool. Cross my heart. The baby had woken again the way babies do at the exact wrong hour and was blinking up at the tall window and the river of stars beyond it. Sirius carried him to the glass. He did not know much about being a father. He knew one thing the Blacks did, though, the one piece of his childhood he had never been able to hate, because his uncle Alfred had done it for him before anyone taught him to be ashamed of it. He lifted Harry until the cold sky filled the whole window. All right, he said, first lesson. This is the only thing this family ever got right, so pay attention. Every Black gets a star. Mine's that one, the bright one low over the moor, the dog star, brightest in the whole sky, which my mother chose because she thought it suited her and which suits me a great deal better, the old bat. He found the one he wanted, a steady amber light away to the east, and guided the baby's loose fist toward it. And that one's going to be yours. Doesn't have a fancy name yet. That's all right. We'll give it one. Come up here every clear night, you and me, and we'll find it, and one day you'll be able to find it on your own. And however bad it gets, and pup, I won't lie to you, it is going to get bad, you'll always be able to look up and know exactly where you are. That's the whole trick. That's everything I've got. Find your star and you're never lost. Harry's fist closed on nothing, on starlight, and held it, and Sirius laughed once wetly and did not let go of him for a long time. The baby slept. The moor shone, far across the hall, half hidden in the shadow of the staircase where he had not been able to make himself go up to bed. Regulus Black sat with his knees drawn up and listened to his brother make promises to a child, and pressed the heel of his hand hard against a heavy gold locket that he wore against his chest under his shirt, a locket he had nearly died to take and had not yet found the courage to destroy, and made a promise of his own that he did not say aloud. In her tower at the far end of the hall, Cassiopeia Black did not sleep. She sat at a desk that had belonged to her grandmother's grandmother, under a window full of stars, with a great book open before her and a quill gone dry in her hand, and she stared at a page she had read 1,000 times, a genealogy that ran in 2 long branches down from a single crown name 900 years gone. The left branch she had filled in last night in fresh ink, a name added at the very bottom, Harry James Potter. The sun line, the king, the right branch ended in nothing. It ended 3 centuries up in a cluster of crossed-out names and one notation in faded hand that had defeated every keeper of the oath since. Line of the moon, hidden, all trace concealed by the last queen's own command. The queen line, the silver crown. The other half of the binding without which the king was only a king, and the crown of Albion could never wake, and the wards of Britain would go on rotting while dark lords rose out of the rot. A king needs a queen, the old magic said. The throne is 2 thrones. The covenant binds a pair or it binds nothing at all. Have you, Cassiopeia said to the dark page, to the crossed-out names, to the queen who had hidden her daughters so well that 9 centuries of the most relentless family in Britain had never found a single one. One of you is out there, a girl with the moon in her blood and no idea what she is, raised in some quiet place where no one ever thought to look. And I am old, and I have 1 king in a cradle downstairs and perhaps 10 good years left in me, and I do not have time for you to stay hidden. She dipped the dry quill in ink at last. Below the empty branch, in a hand that did not shake though it had every right to, she wrote a single word and underlined it twice, and it was less a note than an order given to the future. Find her. Outside, over Selim Hall, the stars wheeled toward morning, brighter than the stars over anywhere else in Britain, and in a cot in a warm room, a king of 15 months slept with his fist around a borrowed finger, and far to the south, in a tidy house in a tidy town called Crawley, a girl of 2 years old woke crying in the dark for no reason her parents could name, and would not be soothed until they brought her to the window and showed her the moon. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, Towger's purr. On clear nights Harry was allowed onto the roof, and the roof of Selim Hall was the best place in the world. He had to be 5 to go up, and he had been 5 for 2 months now, and he had not missed a clear night since. There was a flat lead walk behind the eastern gable, sheltered from the wind by the chimneys, with an iron rail his godfather had charmed soft so that a boy could lean his whole weight against it, and it would only hold him the way a hand holds. From up there the moor fell away black and silver to the edge of the marches, and the sky over the Welsh hills held more stars than any sky Harry had ever seen in the picture books, because the Blacks had built their house under the clearest dark in Britain, and because Sirius said the house wanted you to be able to see. Right, Sirius said, settling cross-legged on the lead with a mug of something that steamed. Find it. Harry found it without looking at the rest of the sky, which was the whole point, which had taken him a year of clear nights to learn. Low in the east, away from the bright crowd of the others, a steady amber light, not the showiest, not the one anybody would pick first. There, he said and pointed, and the star seemed to brighten when he did it, though Sirius always said that was Harry's eyes doing it and not the star, and Harry always privately disagreed. There, Sirius agreed. Still got no name. It doesn't need one, everything needs a name eventually, pup, that's how you keep it. Sirius drank. The steam smelled of cinnamon and the cold smelled of frost coming, and somewhere below them a window banged where Tonks had left it open again. But there's no rush. You'll know the right one when you've got something to hang it on. My old Uncle Alfred told me that, the only one of my whole rotten family worth a nut, except this lot, and they're new. He said a black star is a promise he makes to himself about who he's going to be. Mine's the dog star, brightest in the sky and can't be trusted indoors. He nudged Harry with an elbow. Yours is the patient one, the one you have to know where to look for. That's not nothing, you know, that's a good kind of star to be. Harry leaned on the soft iron and looked at the patient star and thought about being a patient kind of person, which sounded difficult, and decided he would work up to it. Below them, 2 floors down, a lamp moved behind a curtained window in the west tower where Aunt Cassiopeia never slept, and where Harry had begun to notice the grown-ups went one at a time when they thought he was asleep and came back down with their voices pitched low. Sirius, he said, what's in the west tower? The mug stopped halfway to his godfather's mouth. Then it finished the journey and Sirius drank, and when he answered his voice was the easy one he used when he was choosing his words, which Harry had also learned to notice. Books, he said. Aunt Cass's books, boring ones, old ones, the kind that bite if you read them wrong. He set the mug down on the lead. Why do you ask? Regulus came down last night and his face was wet. For a while neither of them said anything. The frost came on a little more. Then Sirius reached over and pulled Harry into his side, an arm right round, a hand flat between the shoulder blades, and Harry let himself be pulled, because the roof was cold and his godfather was warm and the patient star was where it was supposed to be. Your Uncle Regulus carries some heavy things, Sirius said quietly. Older than you, older than this house, some of them. And one day, when you're bigger, we're going to put some of those heavy things in your hands too, because they're yours by right, and because hiding them from you would be exactly the kind of thing this family used to do that I swore we wouldn't do anymore. His hand pressed once firm. But not tonight. Tonight you found your star and the milk's gone cold, and it's an hour past when Andromeda will have my hide. Tonight you just get to be 5. Deal. Deal, said Harry, who did not understand most of it and understood the important part, which was that something was coming, and that the people who loved him had decided he was not yet big enough to carry it. He was 5, he could wait. He fell asleep on the way down the stairs against his godfather's shoulder and did not wake when he was put to bed, and what changed that night was nothing, except that he had asked about the tower and had been told, in the kindest possible way, that the tower had a door he was not yet tall enough to open. The mornings belonged to Andromeda, and the mornings were a fixed and lovely thing. She came down before anyone, even before the house elf Wilkie, who had served the hall for 200 years and resented being beaten to the kitchen, and she made the porridge herself because she said a house that let an elf make all its porridge had forgotten how to be a home. Harry was allowed to stir it. This was a serious office, and he held it gravely. He stood on a stool in the great cold kitchen with its copper and its hanging herbs, and he stirred the pot in the slow figure eights she had shown him, while Andromeda moved around behind him laying the long table and telling him things. She told him useful things, mostly. Which plants in the garden would help you, and which would hurt you, and which would do both depending on the moon. How to tell when someone was lying by watching their hands and not their face. The names of all the cousins on the tapestry, and which ones had been kind, and which ones he must be polite to in portraits but need not believe. She was a healer, Andromeda, trained at St. Mungo before she married Ted and got herself burned off the family tree for it, and she had a way of turning the worst things in the world into a list of useful tasks, and Harry, stirring porridge, soaked all of it up without knowing he was being taught. And Andromeda, he said on the morning that the rest of his life began to turn, though he did not know that either. Why did they burn you off the tree? Andromeda set down the last spoon. She came and stood beside the stool so that her face was level with his, which she always did when a question deserved a real answer, and she had the family's gray eyes, softer than Cassiopeia's, harder than Sirius's. Because I married a man my mother thought was beneath us, she said, a muggle-born wizard, Ted. The best man I have ever known, your Uncle Ted, and my mother looked at him and saw nothing but his blood, and when I would not give him up she took a wand and burned my face off a tapestry as if a tapestry were the same thing as a daughter. She tucked a strand of Harry's hair back from the scar, the way they all did, the whole family, an unconscious habit, a checking. She was wrong, the wrongest a person can be. And I want you to understand, Harry, properly, young as you are, because you live in a house that says Towger's purr on every wall, and one day someone is going to tell you that those words mean what my mother thought they meant: blood, cleanness, keeping the wrong people out. What do they mean? Ask your Aunt Cassiopeia, Andromeda said. She'll tell it better than I can, and it'll frighten you less coming from her, which is a strange thing to say about Cass, but true. Now stir, you've let it catch. He stirred. Tonks thundered down the back stairs with her hair the color of a fire engine because she was 8 and thought it was funny, and Ted came in yawning and stole a piece of toast and got his hand smacked, and Regulus came last and quiet and sat at the foot of the table where the light was poorest, and the morning assembled itself around Harry the way it did every day, warm and loud in his. What changed was only a question lodged in him like a seed, that the proudest words in his house meant 2 different things to 2 different people, and that he would have to find out which one was true. There were rituals that held the week together, and Harry could have recited them in his sleep, which was the point of them. Saturday the whole house walked the wards, the lot of them, even Ted, who could not feel a ward if it bit him, pacing the old stones at the edge of the moor while Cassiopeia named each one and made Harry name them back. Sunday Wilkie was forbidden the kitchen, and Sirius cooked, badly, gloriously, and burned at least one thing on purpose so that the smoke alarm portrait in the hall would shriek and they could all shout at it together. Every clear night there was the roof and the star. And every single morning, no matter what storms had come in the dark or what owls had brought what news to the West Tower, there was Andromeda before anyone, and the porridge, and a stool for a small king to stand on, and a question aloud at the stirring of it, because she said a child who is permitted his questions grows up unafraid of the answers. Harry did not know yet how rare a thing it was to be raised in a house with that many fixed and gentle points to steer by. He only knew that the week had a shape, and the shape had his name woven through it, and that this, whatever the portraits muttered and whatever moved behind the tower door, was what it meant to belong. The afternoons, when the weather held, belonged to flying, and flying belonged to Sirius, and the first time Harry got more than 3 feet off the ground, he understood his godfather completely and forever. It was a training broom, low and slow and charmed so that it could not climb above the height of a tall man or go faster than a trotting horse, and Harry hated it on principle and loved it past all reason. Sirius walked beside him across the south lawn with one hand hovering under the bristles, not quite touching, ready, and Tonks circled them both on her own broom, doing things with her hair that were meant to be distracting and were. Eyes forward, pup, not on your cousin, she's showing off and it'll get her killed one day. Lean there, feel that, that's the broom asking you a question. You answer it with your knees, not your hands. Hands are for holding on, knees are for talking. Sirius jogged to keep pace. Good, that's better than your father's first time, and I was there for your father's first time. He went straight into a hedge and proposed to it. He did not, said Tonks upside down. He did, lovely hedge. We were all very happy for them. Sirius dropped his steadying hand away without telling Harry he was doing it, and for 10 feet, 15, 20, Harry flew with nothing under him but his own balance and the broom's patience, and the wind came off the moor cold and clean and smelling of gorse, and something in Harry's chest came loose and lifted that had nothing to do with the broom. He did not go into a hedge. He turned, wide and wobbling and entirely his own, banked the way the broom had asked him to with his knees, and came back round to where his godfather had stopped walking and stood very still in the middle of the lawn with one hand still raised to a height where no boy was. Sirius, I turned it. You turned it, Sirius said. His voice did an odd thing on the second word. You certainly did. Tonks landed badly, which was how she landed everything, in a heap of fire engine hair and elbows, and bounced up grinning. And Andromeda's voice came across the lawn from the kitchen door promising violence to anyone who broke an arm before supper, and Harry hung there 3 feet over the grass on his own balance with the whole grey marches spread out beyond the wall, and laughed, and Sirius watched him laugh and did not lower his hand for a while, because there was the godson he had promised James he would keep. Flying, grinning, turning the thing under him with his knees the way you are supposed to turn the things that carry you, and there, just under it, harder to look at, was the other thing. That a child who flies like that, who answers the question with his body and grins at the drop, is going to be very difficult one day to keep on the ground. What changed that afternoon was small, and it was everything. Harry learned that the air was his and that the ground could wait, and Sirius learned that he was going to have to be brave enough for both of them about that. He asked Cassiopeia that afternoon in the long gallery, because the long gallery was where she conducted what she called his education and everyone else called being terrorized by a portrait collection. She was teaching him the family frame by frame, walking him down the centuries with her cane clicking on the flags. She did not soften them. That was the thing about Cassiopeia that Harry had worked out early and treasured. She told the truth about people even when the people were hanging right there and could hear her. Phineas Nigellus, she said, stopping before a sour-faced wizard who immediately pretended to be asleep. Headmaster of Hogwarts, the least popular in its history and proud of it, clever as a snake and twice as cold, my grandfather. He loved exactly 4 things in his life and 3 of them were himself. The portrait made an outraged noise. Cassiopeia ignored it and clicked on. Misapprehension, she said, is the family disease. We are a clever house and a faithful house, and we have spent most of our history being clever and faithful about entirely the wrong thing. Aunt Andromeda said to ask you what Tauger's purr means. Cassiopeia stopped. She turned and she looked down at him, fierce and silver and tall as a closed door, and then she did a thing she did perhaps twice a year. She lowered herself onto the gallery bench so that she was no taller than he was, both hands folded on the head of her cane, and she gave him the whole of her attention, which was a heavy and wonderful thing to be given. It means always pure, she said. That is what the words say. And for 200 years this family has taken that to mean keep the blood clean, marry your cousins, let no muggle born and no half-blood and no blood traitor into the house, and they have done murder and worse to keep it, and it has made us hated and very nearly made us evil, and it is a lie. Her voice did not rise. It went, if anything, quieter, and the portraits up and down the gallery went quiet with it, leaning out of their frames to listen, because this was the family's oldest argument and they all knew it. Here is the truth, child, and you are the only one in 3 generations I have bothered to tell it to plainly, because you are the only one it has ever truly belonged to. Pur does not mean clean. It is older than that, older than the word for blood. It means faithful, whole, unbroken, Tauger's pur. Always faithful, always whole. She lifted one hand off the cane and touched, very lightly, the scar on his forehead. We are not the keepers of a bloodline, Harry. We are the keepers of a promise. We made it 900 years ago to a king, and we have kept it through every kind of darkness, even when we forgot what it was and turned it into something small and cruel, always faithful, to the line, to the throne, to the thing that is coming back. Her hand dropped. You will understand the rest when you are older, but understand this now so that no one can ever poison it in you. The words on these walls are not about keeping people out. They are about never, ever letting go of the people and the promises that are yours. Do you see the difference? I think so, said Harry, who saw it the way you see the shape of a country on a map before you have ever walked an inch of it. It means you don't leave. Something moved across Cassiopeia's hard old face that he had no name for. She stood with the help of the cane, and her knees cracked like a dueling spell, and she looked down at him with her sea-gray eyes gone bright. Yes, she said, it means you don't leave out of the mouths of infants. She clicked her cane once on the stone. That is enough philosophy. You are 5 and you have not yet learned to disarm a garden gnome. Come, we will be terrible to the rose bushes until supper. And she swept off down the gallery with the portraits applauding her behind her back, and Harry ran to catch up. And what changed was that the proudest words in his house had been handed to him true, by the one person fierce enough to be trusted with them. And he carried the true meaning out of that gallery, and never once, in all the years and all the temptations that came after, let anyone take it from him. Evenings, more and more, Harry spent with Regulus, and the hours with Regulus were the quiet ones, and Harry came to love them in a different key than he loved the rest. His uncle taught the old tongue, the language under the spells, the words the family had spoken before there was an England to speak English in. Regulus did not teach it the way Cassiopeia taught the portraits, with the whole weight of 9 centuries pressing down. He taught it the way you handle something that has burned you once, gently, a word at a time, in a small bright study off the library where the lamp was always low and the fire was always lit and the door was always open a hand's width, because Regulus could not, Harry had noticed, sit in a closed room. Say it again, Regulus said. He had written the word on a slate in the curling old letters, and Harry traced it with a finger and tried to make his mouth do what the marks asked. Siphon, Harry said. Closer, the middle of it lives at the back of the throat here, not the front. Regulus touched his own throat, and the lamplight caught for a moment on a fine chain that disappeared under his collar, and on the heavy shape that hung from it against his chest, a weight he wore always and never showed and held sometimes without seeming to know he was doing it, the way a man holds a wound. Siphon, try. Siphon, what does it mean? Whole, Regulus said, unbroken. It is the oldest root of pur, the word Aunt Cassiopeia gave you in the gallery. Before it meant faithful, it meant whole, and before it meant whole, it meant a thing that has not been divided against itself. A cup that does not leak, a vow that has not been part kept. His finger rested on the slate. It is the most important word I know, and I learned it too late to use it, and I am teaching it to you early so that you will not make my mistakes. A man can break himself, Harry. He can divide himself against himself, a piece here and a piece there, for what seem at the time like very good reasons, and wake up one morning to find there is not enough of him left in any one place to love anybody or be loved or even die properly when the time comes. His hand had gone without his noticing to the weight under his collar. Siphon, stay whole, whatever they offer you for the pieces. Promise me you'll remember the word even if you forget everything else I teach you. I promise, said Harry, who did not understand and would, terribly, years later, and who reached out then with the simple certainty of a child and put his own small hand over his uncle's, over the hidden weight without knowing what he was touching, only that his uncle's face had gone somewhere far off and dim, and that hands were better than words for bringing people back from far places, because Andromeda had taught him that too. Regulus went very still. Then his other hand came up and covered Harry's, and for a moment the two of them sat in the low lamplight with their hands stacked over the thing that hung against Regulus's heart, the heavy locket that he had nearly died to steal and had not yet found the courage to unmake, and Regulus Black, who had not let anyone touch it or even see it in 2 years, let a 6-year-old's hand rest on it and did not flinch away. "You are a good boy," he said low. "Better than this family deserves." "Better than I am, and I am trying, which is the most I have ever been able to say." He cleared his throat and lifted Harry's hand gently off and set it back on the slate, and the lamp steadied, and the word waited there in its old curling letters. Again, siphon, and this time mean it the way you mean a promise. Siphon, Harry said, and meant it, and what changed that evening was that the most haunted person in the house had been reached, a little, through a closed door held open a hand's width, by a child who did not yet know there was anything to reach for, and that Regulus Black slept that night without the dream for the first time in a long while, and woke wanting, for once, to be alive. Arcturus Black died in the spring when Harry was 6, and it was the first death Harry understood. He had known the old lord only a little. Arcturus did not live at the hall. He kept to the London house on Grimmauld Place, vast and grim, where he conducted the affairs of the house from a chair by a green fire and received Harry, on the 4 or 5 occasions they met, with a grave courtesy that Harry had found more frightening than warmth, and later, missed more than he expected to. The old man had called him sir, a 6-year-old sir. The first time Harry had looked around for whoever Arcturus was really talking to. When the word came by owl on a wet gray morning, the whole house changed temperature. Harry felt it through the floor before anyone told him. Wilkie the elf began to keen in the kitchen. The portraits in the gallery turned their faces to the wall, all of them, all at once, a courtesy of the dead to the dying. And Sirius, who had been laughing at the breakfast table one moment, went still with the letter in his hand, and stood, and walked out of the room without a word, which Sirius never did. They went to Grimmauld Place for the passing. Harry had not been there before. It was everything Selim Hall was not, narrow and dark and full of severed elf heads and a screaming portrait that Sirius gagged with a curtain the moment they arrived, and at the top of it all, in a great black bed, the lord of the House of Black was a small dry shape under the blankets with the family's gray eyes burning out of a face gone to paper. He was lucid to the end. That was the thing the healers said with respect, that Arcturus Black had refused every draft that would have made it easier because he had business to conclude and intended to conclude it awake. He called them in one at a time. When it was Harry's turn, Sirius carried him to the bedside and set him on a chair and stood behind him with both hands on his shoulders, and the old man looked at the child for a long moment out of those terrible bright eyes. "Come here, sir," Arcturus said. His voice was a thread, closer. "I cannot reach you, and I will not have you reaching for me. It is undignified for both of us." Harry leaned in. The room smelled of beeswax and medicine, and under it of the thing Harry's body had recognized in the ruined house at Godric's Hollow when he was too small to remember it, and had recognized again now without knowing why. "I am dying," Arcturus told him, matter of fact, the way Andromeda told him which plants would hurt. "This is not a tragedy. I am 117 years old, and I have done the one thing I was put here to do, which is to keep this house faithful long enough to hand it to someone who could keep it kind. That someone is standing behind you with his hands on your shoulders, and 20 years ago I would have told you he was the greatest disappointment this family ever produced, and I would have been a fool, which I was for a very long time." The bright eyes moved up to Sirius and back down. "I am leaving him the ring. Lordship of the house, and I am leaving you, sir, the only thing I have that is worth more, which is a piece of advice, and you will not understand it for years, so I require you to memorize it now and unwrap it later. Will you do that for a dying old man?" "Yes, sir," whispered Harry. "Power that is given to you is a debt," Arcturus said. "Power that you take is a theft. The difference between a king and a tyrant is which one he believes he is doing, and the worst tyrants in history were certain, every one of them, that the crown had been given. When they put it on your head, Harry Potter, and they will, do not believe for one instant that you have been given anything. Believe that you have been lent it by people who could starve, and that every day you keep it you owe them the rent." A dry sound that might have been a laugh. "There. Now I have lectured a child on his deathbed, and I find I am content. Sirius, the ring is in the box on the table. Put it on before I go, so that the house does not spend even 1 hour without a lord. I have been faithful. Let me see the faith kept before I close my eyes." Sirius came around the bed. He was not laughing now, and his hands were not steady, and Harry watched his godfather lift a heavy black ring out of a velvet box and look at it as though it might bite, which Harry would learn it could. Cassiopeia spoke the words from the foot of the bed, the old words, the claiming words Harry had heard once before in a cottage by the sea and did not remember. The ring went onto Sirius's hand. The house drew a breath, the way it had drawn a breath the night Harry first crossed its threshold, and somewhere far below the screaming portrait fell silent in the middle of a scream, and Arcturus Black looked at his grandson wearing the lordship and let go of the thread of his voice, and a little after of everything else. Harry cried. He was not ashamed of it. Sirius sat down on the edge of the dead man's bed with the ring heavy on his hand and pulled Harry against him, and they were wet-faced together, the new lord of the House of Black and his 6-year-old heir. And that was the first grief Harry ever carried all the way through to the other side, and he learned from it the thing the family had been trying to teach him all along, which was that you do not get to keep people, you only get to be faithful to them, and that being faithful is the whole of love when the keeping runs out. Dumbledore came to the funeral, and the funeral was where Harry met him properly, and it did not go the way the old wizard intended. The rite was held at Salem Hall on the moor, under a sky that for once held no stars because it was noon and gray. The old houses came, the ones that still answered a black summons, cold, beautiful people in cold, beautiful black who looked at Harry too long and said his name like a question. And among them, uninvited and unsurprising, in robes of deep mourning violet that managed to be the most cheerful thing on the moor, came Albus Dumbledore. He found Harry by the refreshment table, which Harry had been stationed at by Tonks with strict instructions to guard the treacle tart, and he crouched down to Harry's level with the ease of a man who had been crouching down to children's levels for 100 years. "You will be Harry," he said. The blue eyes behind the half-moon glasses were kind and bright and went all the way down, exactly as everyone had always said, and somewhere down at the very bottom of all that kindness was something else, and Harry, 6 years old and freshly schooled by Andromeda and watching hands and not faces, looked at Dumbledore's hands. They were folded, still, too still, the hands of a man holding something in place. "I have wanted to meet you for a very long time. I knew your mother and father. I was, I think, rather fond of them and they of me, though we did not always agree. They would be so proud of the young man you are becoming." "Thank you, sir," Harry said, because Arcturus had taught him sir, and the word still felt new and important in his mouth. "Such manners," Dumbledore smiled. "Tell me, Harry, are you happy here? It is a grand house, the grandest I know, and a famous family, but grandeur and fame are heavy things to lay on a small boy, and I find I worry. An old man's privilege, worrying. If ever you were not happy, if ever this house asked of you more than a child should give, you would have only to send me word and I would come. I am the headmaster of a school you will attend one day, and I look after my students before they are ever mine. You would have a friend in me, a door that is always open. Do you understand?" And it was kindly said, and it was nearly all true, and a lonelier child, a child raised in a cupboard with no star of his own, might have heard in it the first warm voice in a cold life and given the old man his whole trust on the spot. Harry heard something else. He heard a grown-up offering him a secret door away from his family, on the day they had buried their lord, with his godfather 30 feet away wearing a ring that had not yet stopped being heavy. He heard, under the kindness, the still hands of a man who wanted something held in place. "I'm happy here," Harry said. "This is my family. I don't need another door." The blue eyes did not change, but something in the long face settled, and Dumbledore inclined his head, the gracious loser of a hand he had not really expected to win. And when he rose to his great violet height, there was Sirius at Harry's shoulder, arrived silent the way the family arrived, with the new ring catching the gray light. "Albus," Sirius said, "come to pay your respects, or to recruit my son over the treacle tart." "To pay my respects," said Dumbledore mildly, "which I have done, and to observe, which I have also done, and to leave you with one observation freely given, Lord Black, since the title is yours now, and the burden with it." He looked at Sirius, and the kindness on his face did not waver, and the steel under it came up to meet the new young lord like a blade laid flat across an open palm, an offer and a warning at once. "You have what your grandfather wanted, a house made kind. I am glad of it, more glad than you will credit. But a kind house is a soft thing in a hard season, and the season that is coming is the hardest this country has seen since I was young, and I have read the same omens Cassiopeia reads in the same books, and some she has never been permitted. You are raising that child toward a throne. I am asking you, as one who buried the last people who tried to put a crown on a head in this country, to consider that you may be raising him toward a cliff." He settled his hat. "I will not interfere today. But I will be his headmaster, and I will watch, and if I ever come to believe that this family is walking that boy off the edge of the world for the sake of a 900-year-old promise, I will do a great deal more than offer him a door. Good afternoon. The treacle tart is excellent. My compliments to the elf." And he was gone, between one gray gust and the next, in the way of very great wizards, and Sirius let out a breath and put his hand, the ringed one, on the back of Harry's neck, and what changed on the day they buried Arcturus Black was that the lines were drawn. The old man who would watch, and the family that would raise the child, and the child himself, who had looked into the kindest eyes in Britain and declined the open door, and would go on declining it because his aunt had taught him in a long gallery what the words on the walls really meant. "You don't leave." The other thing that changed that spring happened in the West Tower. Behind the door Harry was not yet tall enough to open, and Harry knew nothing of it for years, and it was the most important thing of all. Cassiopeia and Regulus had found her. It had taken the whole of Harry's young life. Regulus had given it everything he had, which was a great deal, because a man trying to outrun what he had done in the Dark Lord's service will work harder than any free soul alive, and the work had become his penance and then slowly his purpose. He had quartered the country. He had read parish registers and squib lists and the secret ledgers the old houses kept of bloodlines they pretended not to track. He had followed the moonline down through 3 centuries of crossed-out names and deliberate dead ends, a trail laid by a queen 900 years dead specifically, so that no one, not even the most faithful house in Britain, could ever follow it. And on a wet night in spring in the West Tower, with the genealogy spread out under the window full of stars, Regulus Black laid his finger on a name in a Crawley parish register and made a sound that brought Cassiopeia up out of her chair. A girl. Born the 19th of September, 1979. Daughter on the register of 2 Muggle dentists named Granger, decent ordinary people who loved her to distraction and had no idea, none, that the child they had brought home from a hospital was not entirely the child they thought, that there had been a second concealment laid under the first, a binding so old and so gentle that it had hidden a queen's heir in plain sight inside an ordinary family for the whole of her short life. The moon was in the girl's blood. Regulus had checked it 3 ways and Cassiopeia had checked it a 4th, the way that could not be fooled, and the 4th way had answered yes. And an old woman who had spent her whole long life keeping a faith the world called a children's tale sat down in her chair by the window and put her face in her hands, which Regulus had never seen her do, and stayed that way for a while. Then she lifted her head, and her sea-gray eyes were dry and bright and terrible, and she looked at the name in the register the way a starving woman looks at bread. Hermione, she read, Hermione Jean Granger, after the queen in the Winter's Tale, the one they turned to stone for 16 years and who came back to life when she was loved enough. A sound out of her that was almost a laugh. Of course, that is her name. The mother always did love a sign, even when she was hiding her own daughter from the whole of magical Britain. Regulus. She rose. The cane took her weight. Below them, 2 floors down, a 6-year-old king slept with his fist closed on nothing, on a star with no name, dreaming the ordinary dreams of a child who was loved. We have both of them now. After 900 years, the House of Black has the sun and the moon under its hand at last, and one of them does not yet know magic is real, and the other does not yet know he is anything but an ordinary boy with a star. We will not rush it. We will do this gently and rightly and slowly, the way Sirius has made us learn to do things. She rolled the genealogy closed and held it against her chest. But write it in the book, Regulus. Write her in beneath the empty branch where it has said find her since the night the king came home. Write her in and underline it, and let the old order be answered. And Regulus Black, who had carried a heavy gold locket and a heavier secret down out of a dark cave 2 years before, and had not yet found the courage to destroy the one or the strength to be forgiven the other, dipped the quill. And below the line that had read find her for so long in a hand that shook only a little, he wrote the answer the house had waited 9 centuries to write, and what changed that night, 2 floors above a sleeping child who knew nothing of it, was everything. The throne of Albion had its pair at last, and the only question left was how to bring a Muggle-raised girl gently into a story she had been born into and never been told. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The girl who was hidden. They told Harry a week before she came, which was exactly right, because a week was long enough to get used to the idea and too short to ruin it with worrying. Sirius told him on the roof, under the patient star, which was where they told each other the things that mattered. There's a girl coming, he said, next Saturday, with her mum and dad. They'll stay a while if it goes well, and I think it's going to go well, but I'm not certain, and I won't lie to you, so I'm telling you the truth. It might not, and if it doesn't, none of it will be your fault. Who is she? Sirius was quiet a moment. Below them, the moor breathed cold up the side of the house. You know how Aunt Cass goes on about the throne, he said. The crown of Albion, the thing that's coming back, the king. That's me, said Harry, who had been told this carefully and gently over the past year, a piece at a time, the way you give a child a heavy thing, and who had decided on balance that it was interesting but not as interesting as flying. I'm the king when I'm big. You're the king when you're big, Sirius agreed. Except here's the part Aunt Cass has been saving, because it's the part that's actually good news instead of just enormous. The throne isn't 1 chair, pup, it's 2. The old magic doesn't crown a king on his own, never has. It crowns a pair. A king and a queen equals both of them, neither one over the other, because a crown on a single head goes bad. They learned that the hard way a long time ago, and it nearly ended us. He turned his head, and the starlight was on his face. There has to be a queen. The Covenant won't wake without her. And we've been looking for her for as long as we've had you, your aunt and your uncle Regulus, every night in that tower, and a while ago they found her. Harry thought about this. He was 7, and the idea of a queen was abstract, and the idea of another child was not. Is she my age, year older, near enough? Does she fly? I have absolutely no idea, Sirius said, but I'd put money on no, because she's been raised by Muggles in a town called Crawley, and she doesn't know any of this yet. She doesn't know magic's real. She doesn't know she's anything but an ordinary clever girl with a mum and a dad who love her. Saturday's the day we tell her, and Harry, listen, this is the important bit, the bit I actually climbed up here in the cold to say. He took Harry by the shoulder and turned him so they were facing. She's going to find out in one afternoon what you've had 7 years and this whole family to get used to, that she's not who she thought, that there's a crown with her name on it. That her mum and dad aren't her blood mum and dad, that she was hidden with them as a baby to keep her safe, and that everyone she's ever known kept it from her for love but kept it. That's a lot to land on a person, so you don't crowd her and you don't show off and you don't tell her the scary parts before she's ready. You just be there. You be the one person in this whole mad house who isn't asking her to be a queen. Can you do that? Yes, said Harry, and meant it, because he understood being told you were something enormous before you were ready, and he understood, better than anyone in the house except perhaps Regulus, what it was worth to have someone nearby who only wanted you to be a person. What changed that week was that Harry stopped thinking of the Queen as a piece of the throne and started thinking of her as a girl who was about to have the worst and most interesting afternoon of her life, and decided, before he ever met her, that he was going to be on her side. The Grangers arrived at 11 on Saturday by a car that could not possibly have driven up the moor track and had, which was Sirius's doing, and which Mr. Granger kept looking back at with the expression of a man whose understanding of the world had sprung a leak. They were exactly what Andromeda had said they would be: decent, frightened, fierce. Mr. and Mrs. Granger, dentists of Crawley, who had been visited 3 times over the past month by a tall, terrifying old woman and a gentle, haunted young man and a roguish lord, and who had been told, with documents and proof and finally with magic done quietly in their own sitting room, that the daughter they had raised for 8 years had been placed with them as an infant under a concealment older than their town, and that she was the heir of a line of magical queens, and that the time had come to begin. Gently to tell her, they had not taken it well, no one with any sense would have, but they had done the thing that told Harry everything about them before he had exchanged a word with their daughter. They had said, yes, you may tell her on one condition: that we are in the room, that we hold her hand while you do it, and that the moment she wants to come home she comes home and your crown can go hang. Cassiopeia had agreed to every word of it. Cassiopeia, who agreed to nothing, had looked at Helen Granger across a Crawley coffee table and said, you are exactly the mother I would have chosen for her, and I have been choosing for 900 years, and Helen Granger had burst into tears and made more tea, and between them, holding her mother's hand, came Hermione. Harry had built a picture of her in his head over the week, and she demolished it in the first 3 seconds, which he would later understand was the most Hermione thing she could possibly have done. She was small and brown, and her hair was an event, a great brown thundercloud of it that no ribbon had ever fully governed, and she had her front teeth a little large for her face and a book under her free arm and eyes that went around the great hall of Selim Hall, the portraits in the soaring window and the impossible scale of it, cataloging fast, taking inventory, deciding things. She looked frightened. She also looked, underneath the fright, profoundly annoyed, which Harry found he liked at once, because it was exactly how he felt about most things that were bigger than him and refused to explain themselves. She fixed on Harry. He was the only thing in the hall her own size. Are you a king? She said. It was not really a question. It was a challenge delivered to establish the facts. They told my parents there's a king. A boy, is it you? You don't look like a king. Harry, said Sirius warningly from somewhere above. It's me, Harry said, ignoring his godfather because this was between him and the girl and he had decided about her on the roof a week ago. And you're right, I don't. I look like a kid who fell off a broom this morning, which I did. Nobody looks like a king. That's the whole trick of it, my aunt says. The ones who look like kings are usually the ones you want to watch. He came down the last 2 steps so they were level. You're Hermione. You don't look like a queen either, if it helps. You look like somebody about to ask 40 questions. A flicker went over her cross-frightened face. I have 200 questions, she said. I started writing them down in the car. My dad says it isn't polite to interrogate people, but I think it's worse to not understand things and pretend you do so. She lifted her chin. I'm going to ask all of them. Good, said Harry. Ask me first. I'll tell you the true answers. The grown-ups tell you true answers too, but they wrap them up so they don't scare you, and I think that's worse, like your dad in the interrogating. So ask me and I won't wrap anything. He held out his hand, which he had seen Sirius do, lord to lord, an offer between equals. Deal. Hermione looked at his hand. She looked at his face hard, the look of a girl who had been disappointed by people who promised true answers before. Then she let go of her mother's hand and shifted her book to her other arm and shook his once hard, the way you close a contract. Deal, she said. First question, if the throne's 2 chairs and one of them's mine, does that mean I have to marry you? Because I'm 8 and that's disgusting and I want it in writing that I don't. Behind Harry, Sirius made a sound like a man swallowing a laugh whole. Up in the gallery a portrait gasped. And Harry, 7 years old, looked the future Queen of Albion in her cross-brown eyes and gave her the first true answer of 1,000 he would give her. No, he said. Aunt Cass already explained it to me because I asked the exact same thing, except I said it was gross, not disgusting. The crown doesn't care about marrying. It cares about the 2 of you being equals and trusting each other all the way down with nothing held back, which Aunt Cass says is rarer and harder than marrying and lasts longer. You don't have to marry me, you have to be able to trust me with your life, and I have to be able to trust you with mine, and we get to spend years finding out if we can, and if we can't, the crown stays asleep, and that's allowed. That's the actual deal. Marrying's got nothing to do with it," he considered. "Also, you're right that it'd be disgusting. We're children, I'll sign whatever you want." For one moment, Hermione Granger simply looked at him. Then the cross went out of her face and something cleared behind it, some braced and lonely thing in a clever child who had spent 8 years being too much for every room she walked into, and she said in a different voice, smaller, the cross gone out of it, "You actually answered it. The real one. Nobody ever answers the real one." And what changed in the great hall of Selim Hall, with 2 sets of guardians watching from the stairs and 900 years of portraits holding their painted breath, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The sun looked at the moon and the moon looked back, and they were, from that first cross handshake, each other's, in the particular way of 2 children who have each been the loneliest clever person in every room, until the moment they find one more. They told her the truth that afternoon, all of it that an 8-year-old could hold in the library, with her mother on one side and her father on the other, and Harry across the table where she could see him, because she had asked for that specifically in the third of her 200 questions. "I want that one across from me, he doesn't wrap things," Cassiopeia told it. She was good at it, better than Harry had known, because she told it to Hermione the way Hermione plainly needed to be told things, as a problem with evidence building. She laid out the genealogy, the long silver branch coming down through 9 centuries of crossed-out names and hidden daughters. She laid out the moonline, the queens, the sundering, the empty throne, the wards of Britain rotting quietly for 900 years because no sovereign pair had sat the covenant to hold them. She did not say, "Believe me." She said, "Here is what we found, and here is how we checked it, and here is how you may check it yourself." And Hermione, who had been braced to be lied to grandly, found herself instead being handed a method and could not resist a method, and leaned in over the genealogy with her thundercloud hair falling forward and began, despite herself, to test it. "This is just a tree," she said. "You could draw any tree. Names on paper aren't proof." "No," Cassiopeia agreed, "they are not. Which is why we do not stop at paper." She set on the table a small thing that Harry had never seen brought out of the tower, a disc of silver, plain, old, worn smooth as a riverstone. "This is the Queen's tessera. It is one of the few pieces of the old regalia that came down to this house to keep. For 900 years it has been silver and cold and dead, because the silver answers only to the moonline, and the moonline was lost. We have laid the hands of every black woman in 9 generations on it, hoping. It has never woken. It is, I will tell you plainly, the single object I have most wanted to see come alive in my long life, and it has disappointed me for 90 years. She slid it across the table to stop in front of Hermione. "I am not going to tell you what will happen when you touch it, because I do not entirely know, and because I will not put the answer in your head and then claim the test was fair. Touch it or do not. You are 8 years old, and no one in this room will think less of you for either choice. But if you want proof instead of a tree, that is proof, and it is sitting under your hand." Hermione looked at the disc. She looked at her mother, who nodded white-faced, and at her father, who did not nod and did not shake his head, who only held her other hand tighter, and at Harry, who said nothing, because Sirius had said don't crowd her, and this was the not crowding, the hardest kind, sitting still while someone you have decided about reaches for the thing that will change them. She put her finger on the silver. It woke under her hand like a thing that had been holding its breath for 900 years, which it had. The cold disc went warm, then bright, then it lifted, a half-inch off the table, turning, and out of it came light, silver-white, the exact color of the moon over Crawley that had been the only thing to soothe a crying baby 8 years before, and the light rose and opened and became, for the length of 3 heartbeats, a crown. A circlet of silver fire, hanging in the library air over a muggle dentist's daughter's head, fitted to a brow it had been waiting 9 centuries to find, and every portrait in Selim Hall that could see into the library began softly to weep, and Cassiopeia Black put her hand over her mouth, and the crown of silver light settled the width of a breath above Hermione's thundercloud hair and fit. Hermione did not move. Tears were running down her face, and she did not seem to know it. "It's warm," she whispered. "Why is it warm? It's light. Light isn't warm, that's not." Her method failed her. Her whole catalogue of how the world works failed her at once, and she sat in the wreck of it with a crown of moonlight on her head and turned not to her mother, not to Cassiopeia, but across the table to the one person who had promised not to wrap things. "Harry," she said, "what is it? Tell me true, what is it?" "It's yours," Harry said. His own voice had gone strange. "It was always yours. They didn't put it there, it came." He leaned across the table, careful of the light, and did the thing the family did, the thing Andromeda had taught him without teaching him, and put his hand over hers where it still rested on the warm silver. "You're not who you thought, I know, it's the worst afternoon. But Hermione, you're not less than you thought, you're more, you were always more. They didn't make you a queen this afternoon. They just told you that you'd been one the whole time and nobody got to use it against you. That's the good news. Aunt Cass saves the good news for last." He held her hand on the silver, and the silver held them both. "Your mum and dad still love you. Look at them. That part's not changed. That part's the realest thing in the room." You just got a whole extra family who have been waiting for you for 900 years, and one of them is me, and I'm going to be honest, I'm the best one, the others are very old." A sound came out of Hermione that was half a sob and half, astonishingly, a laugh, and the crown of moonlight dimmed gently as the first shock passed, sinking back into the disk, which cooled and dulled and settled into her palm, hers now, a riverstone of dead silver that would wake for no one else alive. She closed her hand around it. She looked at her parents, who were both crying, who pulled her between them, and she let herself be held, and over her mother's shoulder she found Harry's eyes and held them. And what changed in the library that afternoon was that the loneliest clever girl in Crawley learned she had never been ordinary and never been alone, and chose, with the silver going quiet in her fist, to believe the one person at the table who had promised not to wrap the truth, and to follow him into whatever the rest of it was. They all stayed, the Grangers, that first time for a fortnight and then more and more, because Helen Granger flatly refused to let her daughter be raised toward a throne by anyone she could not personally supervise, and Cassiopeia, who had spent 90 years wanting exactly such a mother for exactly such a queen, gave the Grangers a wing of Selim Hall in the run of the place and a standing seat at every council that touched the child. It made the house fuller and louder, and Harry thought better. Ted Tonks finally had another muggle-raised soul to roll his eyes with, Andromeda had a fellow healer to argue dosages with, and Harry had Hermione. The house learned the Grangers the way it had learned Harry, slowly and then all at once. Wilkie the elf, who had spent 200 years answering to people who treated him as furniture, did not know what to do with a muggle dentist who said thank you and meant it, and resolved the difficulty by adopting the Grangers wholesale and bringing Mr. Granger his tea exactly as he liked it before Mr. Granger had worked out how to ask. The smoke alarm portrait in the hall acquired 2 new people to shriek at on Sundays. Helen Granger and Cassiopeia took to walking the wards together at dusk, the Muggle mother and the 900-year-old keeper, and what they said to each other on those walks no one ever learned, but Cassiopeia came back from them gentler and Helen came back from them steadier, and that, Andromeda observed dryly, was a better cure than anything in her dispensary. They put a second stool in the kitchen. Harry stirred the porridge, and Hermione, who could not cook and was personally offended by the fact, kept the recipe book open to the right page and read the instructions aloud with the gravity of a girl performing surgery, and that became a ritual too, the 2 of them in the one pot, and the morning made room for her exactly as it had made room for him. They invented things between them that first year the way children do, except that the things 2 such children invented tended to outlast childhood. There was the 2-star check every clear night on the roof or out a window, or once memorably from the back of a runaway broom. Find the patient amber one in the east, find the white double overhead, and you knew the other was somewhere under the same 2 and you were not lost. There was the hand, one hard squeeze, which meant we are here, we do not leave, and which they used in crowded rooms and dull lessons, and in the years to come, in places a great deal worse. And there was the old tongue, which Regulus had given them and which they made their own, passing notes in it across the long table under the noses of the grown-ups who had taught it to them and could no longer keep up, a secret folded inside a family secret, 2 clever children building a country of 2 that no one else could quite enter. Hermione taught Harry to stop and read 3 moves ahead before he leapt. Harry taught Hermione that some moments would not wait for a conclusion and had to be leapt at anyway. And between the leaping and the reading, they began to build the single instrument the old magic had been waiting 900 years for, which was not a king and not a queen, but the space between them where the 2 became one. Andromeda watched it grow and said nothing, because she had seen what the want of exactly this had done to a clever, lonely child once, in her own mother's cold house, and she was not about to interrupt the cure. The library was where they lived. She found it within an hour of arriving and laid claim to it the way conquerors lay claim to ports, and Harry, who had always found the library a slightly frightening room full of biting books and his aunt's silences, discovered that with Hermione in it, the library became the best place in the house after the roof. She read faster than anyone he had ever seen. She read like he flew, leaning into it, careless of the drop, and she dragged him along behind her up cliffs of old books he would never have attempted alone, and he in turn taught her the things the books did not hold. How to tell when a portrait was lying, which corridors moved on which days, that you answered a broom with your knees and not your hands. That was the bargain they struck without ever naming it. She made him cleverer, he made her braver. And on the clear nights, the very best nights, he took her up onto the roof, which he had shown no one his own age before, and gave her the sky. That one's mine, he told her the first clear night, pointing low to the patient amber star in the east. Sirius gave it to me when I was a baby. It hasn't got a name yet. Every Black gets a star, and you name it when you've got something to hang the name on, he says. I'm still waiting. Hermione looked at his star for a long time, with the whole attention she gave everything, taking inventory. Then she pulled a stub of pencil and a much folded paper from her cardigan, because she was never without them, and she said, "Well, I'm going to learn all of them, properly, with the catalog numbers, not just the family names, the real ones, the ones the whole world uses. So that when you do find a name for yours, you'll know exactly where it sits in the actual sky and not just in your aunt's stories. She had already started writing. And you can have a star for me if every black gets one, and I'm nearly a black now, but I'm choosing it myself. I'm not having one given to me. I've had enough things given to me this month. Fair, said Harry. Which one? She did not even look up from her paper. She lifted the pencil and pointed it without hesitation at a star high overhead, cold and white and certain, brighter than his in the constellation of the Maiden. That one, she said, Spica. It's the brightest in Virgo, and it's actually two stars so close together they look like one, which the books say, and I like that better than being just one star. I think two stars holding that tight and looking like one is the cleverest thing a star can do. She wrote it down, Spica. The pencil stopped. She looked suddenly not at the sky but at him, sidelong, 8 years old and far too sharp. Two that look like one, she said again, slowly, hearing it. Like the throne, two chairs, that's not an accident, is it, that I picked that one? No, said Harry, who had learned from Cassiopeia that the old magic was always leaving signs, and from Sirius that a sign was a thing to read and not to run from. I don't think anything's an accident with you, but it's still yours. You chose it. That's the difference, Aunt Cass says. Given or chosen, you chose. Hermione folded her paper away. She drew her knees up under her chin and looked at her chosen star and his given one, the white and the amber, the maiden's brightest and the patient one in the east, and she said, in the small clear voice she used only on the roof, only to him, I'm scared, Harry. I'm not going to say it in front of the grown-ups because they'll do something about it, but I'm saying it to you because you don't wrap things. I'm scared all the time now. Everything I knew was wrong, and everything that's true is enormous, and someone's going to want me dead for it eventually. I worked that out. You don't get a crown without someone wanting you dead. It's in all the books. She turned her head on her knees. Are you scared? Yes, Harry said. He did not wrap it. All the time. I've been scared since before I could talk. I've got the scar to prove it. But here's the thing I worked out, and it's the only thing I know that's any use. He pointed one star to the other, amber to white, drawing the line between them across the dark. You can always find your star, however bad it gets, and now I can always find yours because you showed me, and you can always find mine. So if it ever goes really wrong, if we ever get split up or lost or anything, we look up and we find the other one's star, and we know exactly where the other person is even if we can't see them. That's the trick Sirius taught me. Find your star and you're never lost, 2 stars and you're never alone. He looked at her, 7 years old and certain. I'll make you a real deal, not a crown deal, us deal. Whatever happens, whoever wants us dead, we don't leave. Towger's purr, it means you don't leave. Aunt Cass told me. We don't ever leave the other one in the dark. Deal. Hermione Granger looked at Harry Potter across the cold lead of the roof, under her chosen star and his given one, and she did not make a joke and she did not ask for it in writing, and what passed between them then was not the covenant of the crown, which was old and vast in the business of kingdoms, but something smaller and to both of them for the rest of their lives larger. The private and unbreakable treaty of 2 children who had each been alone and had decided on a roof to stop. Deal, she said, we don't leave. The lessons began at once, and the lessons were the proof of the thing Sirius had said on the roof, that the crown did not want a king with a queen to fetch his tea, but 2 of a kind, equal, neither over the other. Cassiopeia taught them together. She had taught Harry alone for a year, the family and the creed and the careful first shapes of magic a child could safely hold, and Harry had assumed she would simply add a second chair. She did not. She tore up the whole shape of it and started again, because she said teaching one of them was a different art from teaching 2 who would one day have to think as one, and she was too old to waste years doing it wrong. She set them problems that neither could solve alone. She would give Harry a thing to defend and Hermione a way to take it, and let them go at each other across the long gallery until they understood in their bodies and not just their heads the exact shape of the other's mind. You are quick, she told Harry the first week, after he had thrown himself at a problem and been neatly dismantled by a girl 2 heads of research ahead of him. Quick and brave, and you go straight at the throat, which is a gift, and it will get you killed by the 3rd clever enemy you meet unless you learn to lend your quickness to someone who can see 3 moves past you. And you. She turned on Hermione, who had been allowing herself the beginnings of a satisfied look. You see 3 moves past everyone, and it does you no good at all, because by the time you have finished seeing them, the moment is gone and a braver fool has already acted. You think the world will wait for your conclusion. It will not. He is your speed. You are his sight. Neither of you is the lord here and the other the servant. You are a left hand and a right, and a sword needs both, or it is a poor sort of sword. Again, so they learned each other. They learned it over a chessboard, where Hermione thrashed Harry for a month and then slowly stopped, not because Harry got better at chess, but because he got better at her, at reading the particular way her certainty moved. They learned it in the dueling that Cassiopeia began to teach them with wands too young to do real harm and tempers old enough to, where Harry's nerve covered Hermione's hesitation and Hermione's foresight bridled Harry's recklessness. And where the first time they got it right, the first time they moved against the old witch as one creature with 2 bodies and actually backed her 2 steps across the gallery, Cassiopeia lowered her wand and looked at the pair of them breathing hard and said nothing for a long moment. and then said very quietly, remember what that felt like, that is the throne, everything else is furniture. Regulus taught them the old tongue, both of them now, in the small bright study with the door held open a hand's width, and Hermione took to it as she took to everything, ferociously filling notebooks, demanding to know the grammar behind the grammar, until even Regulus's haunted patience frayed and he laughed, actually laughed, a rusty sound the house had not heard in years, and said she was the first student he had ever had who argued with the language itself. He taught them siphon, the word he had given Harry whole, unbroken, the thing that has not been divided against itself, and Hermione wrote it at the top of a fresh page and underlined it twice, and Harry watched her do it and thought of his aunt writing "find her under an empty branch," and did not yet know why the two things rhymed. And Sirius taught them the thing none of the others could, which was how to stop. How to put the crown and the covenant and the rotting wards of Britain down for an afternoon and go fly, or burn a Sunday roast, or lie on the roof naming stars, because he told them, a king and queen who never learned to set the weight down would be crushed flat under it before they were 20, and he had not raised the two of them out of cupboards and concealments to watch them ground to powder by their own seriousness. He was, in his reckless way, the wisest teacher they had, and the only one who taught them to be children on purpose, as a discipline, a thing to practice, and they practiced it, and it was the lesson that saved them more than once in the years to come. What changed in those first crowded weeks was that two children who had each been the cleverest and loneliest thing in every room they had ever entered stopped being two. The whole house felt it the way the house felt everything, and reorganized itself a degree at a time around the new shape at its center, the sun and the moon learning to move as one, and the portraits in the long gallery, who had argued for 900 years about what the family was for, fell one by one into a watchful and approving quiet, as if the oldest of them had begun at last to believe. The thing came soon after, out of the dark at the edge of the wards, and it taught Harry that Hermione had been right about the books. He felt it before the alarms. He had been asleep, and then he was awake with the scar on his forehead burning cold, a deep, ugly ache he had felt only twice before and would come to know far too well. And he was out of bed and into the corridor in his bare feet before he had decided to move. And Hermione's door was already open, and Hermione was already in the corridor in her nightgown with the dead silver disc clutched in her fist, because she had felt it too, the moon blood and the sun blood waking to the same wrongness in the dark. "You felt it," she whispered, "the cold, like something looking at us." "Wards," Harry said. "Something at the wards. They should have gone to the grown-ups." They went to the window instead, the two of them, the king and the queen of Albion, aged 7 and 8 in their night clothes, and looked out across the moonlit moor, and saw it. A thinness in the dark at the edge of the warded ground, a place where the night had gone wrong, a shape that was almost a man and almost a smoke, hooded, hunched, pressing itself against the invisible wall of the black wards like a starving thing against a window, and where it pressed, the wards burned white and held, and where it pressed, the frost spread out across the spring grass in a black star, and it was looking at the house, at their window. It had no face that Harry could see, and it was looking at them with the whole of its faceless attention, and the scar on his forehead screamed, and beside him Hermione's silver disc flared once, hard, a pulse of moonlight that lit the whole window, and the thing at the wards flinched from the silver and hissed, a sound that came across 200 yards of warded moor as clearly as if it had been spoken in the room. Two of them, after all this time, the cold blood and the bright, he will want to know. He will want to know they are together. Then the corridor behind the children filled with light and fury. Regulus reached them first, faster than Harry had ever seen him move, and he put himself between the children and the window with his wand up and his haunted face gone to iron, and what he said, lo, was not for the children, it was for the thing on the moor, and it was a name. Mulciber. And then in the old tongue, 3 words that made the window glass frost over from the inside, and the thing at the edge of the wards came apart like smoke in a wind and was gone, and the frost star on the grass faded, and the night was only a night again. Sirius was there, and Cassiopeia, and Andromeda gathering both children in at once, and the Grangers white in their dressing gowns, and the house was awake and bright and loud with running feet. But Harry, pressed into Andromeda's side with the ache fading from his scar, was watching his uncle Regulus, who stood at the window still with his wand lowered now, and his hand pressed to the heavy locket under his nightshirt, looking out at the dark where the thing had been. "It wasn't him," Regulus said to Cassiopeia very quietly, not meant for the children and heard by Harry anyway, who heard everything. "Not the Dark Lord himself, a servant, ascending. He's a wraith, a vapor, a thing of smoke in a forest somewhere. You all believe he's gone, and he is not gone. I have told you he is not gone." His knuckles were white on the locket, but that was one of his sniffing at the wards, and it found what it was sent to find. It found that the blood has come back, both bloods, together under one roof. He turned from the window, and his eyes found Harry's across the bright, frightened corridor, and held them, and there was an apology in them, and a promise, and the weight of a secret he had carried 2 years and could feel coming due. "He'll know by morning," Regulus said. Whatever's left of him in that forest will know that the King and Queen of Albion are 7 and 8 years old and asleep in the same house. And he has wanted the throne to stay empty for 50 years because an empty throne is a rotted ward, and a rotted ward is how a thing like him climbs back into the world. He looked at Cassiopeia. It's begun then, sooner than we hoped. They're children and it's already begun. Harry found Hermione's hand in the bright crowded corridor without looking for it, the way you find a banister in the dark, and her fingers were cold and closed hard around his, and the dead silver disc was pressed between their two palms, warm where her skin was cold. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. 3 nights before on the roof, they had made a treaty against exactly this, against the dark and the things in it, and now the dark had come and put its faceless attention on their window and named them to its master. And the treaty held, that was the thing, the treaty held, 2 cold hands and 1 warm coin between them, and a promise that was only 3 nights old and already load-bearing. Hermione turned her head and looked at him, and he looked back, and what went between them was not words and not magic, but the plain animal fact of not being alone in it, which Cassiopeia, watching, understood to be worth more than every ward on the moor. And Cassiopeia Black, keeper of the oath, looked at the 2 children in their night clothes, one with the burning scar and one with the waking silver, who had so lately made a private treaty on a roof that they did not leave each other in the dark, and she did not soften it because she never softened anything, and because she had decided long ago that these 2 would be told the truth. Then we stop hoping for time, she said, and we start making them ready, both of them together, starting tomorrow. She put 1 hand on Harry's head and 1 on Hermione's, the sun and the moon, and the dead silver disc in Hermione's fist glowed faintly in answer to her touch, and far out on the moor the ordinary stars wheeled on, the patient amber one in the east and the cold white double one overhead, 2 that looked like one. They wanted to be children a while longer. They will not get to be. But they will not face it alone, and they will not face it ignorant, and that in this family is the most love we have ever known how to give. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, the old compact on the last clear night before Hogwarts, they were told the whole of it at last, in the West Tower. Behind the door Harry had finally grown tall enough to open. He was 11 now. 3 years had gone by since the silver crown woke over Hermione's head in the library, and they had been crowded years, full of dueling and the old tongue and chess and flying, and the slow, patient work of 2 clever children becoming 1 mind in 2 bodies, and in all that time the family had held back exactly one thing: the West Tower. Cassiopeia had said that first frightened spring that they would be made ready, both of them together, and she had kept the promise to the letter, and the readying ended here, the night before the train, in the room where the genealogy lived under the window full of stars. The whole family came. That was how Harry knew it mattered. Sirius and Andromeda and Ted, Cassiopeia and Regulus, the Grangers, even Tonks, 18 now and an aura in training, her hair gone a serious dark for once. They filled the round tower room, and the lamps came up, and Cassiopeia stood at the great desk with the genealogy open and the Queen's tessera beside it, and she did not soften anything because she never had. You know the shape of it, she said. A throne, a pair, a covenant. Tonight you learn the cost, because tomorrow you go out into the world that paid it, and a sovereign who does not know what their crown cost is the most dangerous fool alive. Sit. This is the true history of Albion, and you are the first heirs in 900 years with the right to hear it, and when I am done you will understand why this house has been hated, and why it kept faith anyway, and what it is you are walking toward. She told it, and the room went away while she told it, and Harry would carry the telling the rest of his life. There had been a sovereignty once, older than the ministry, older than England, a hidden crown over magical Britain bound to the land itself by the oldest binding there is, the covenant, a free giving of self over a thing beloved, the same root from which Lily's sacrifice had grown, and from which every great magic descended. The crown was never one head. The old magic had learned in its first and worst lesson that absolute power poured into a single vessel turns always to poison. So the covenant bound a pair, a king and a queen, sunline and moonline, equal and opposite, each holding the other to the world, each a check on the other's hunger. While the pair sat the throne, the wards of Britain stood, vast and deep and woven through every ley line and hollow hill, and no great darkness could root in the land, because the land itself was held, was loved, was sovereign. And then, 900 years ago, the sundering. The last queen died young, of an ordinary fever, no curse, no war, only the stupid arithmetic of a hard age, and the king, who had loved her past wisdom, refused to let the covenant pass to an heir and take a new queen as the old magic required. He kept the whole crown. He held both halves alone, the sun and the moon in one grieving head, and for a few years his power was a wonder and a terror, and then it turned, the way the old magic had always warned it would, and the greatest king Albion ever had became, by slow degrees and out of nothing but love and refusal, its only tyrant. They had to put him down in the end, his own sworn houses, the Blacks foremost among them, and the breaking of him broke the covenant. and the broken covenant tore the wards of Britain from one end to the other, and into the wound left behind the ministry grew, a council of frightened houses agreeing never to let one head wear a whole crown again, and the throne went empty, and the wards rotted slowly down the centuries, and every dark lord who ever rose, Harry, every single one, rose because the land was no longer held. Grindelwald, said Hermione very quietly. She had not written a word. Voldemort, they didn't come from nowhere. The wards were rotten. The land was unguarded. The land has been a house with no one home for 900 years, Cassiopeia said, and things move into empty houses. She laid her hand on the genealogy, on the 2 long branches running down to 2 names at the bottom. We swore when we put the last king down that we would keep the regalia safe and the bloodlines alive and faithful until the sun and the moon came back together, both of them equal, a pair the covenant could bind without breaking. We have waited 900 years. We turned cruel in the waiting and forgot what we were waiting for and very nearly damned ourselves, but we kept faith. And here you are, the 2 of you, 11 years old and about to get on a train, and you are not a story anymore. You are the thing the wards have been waiting for. When the 2 of you are grown and ready and willing and not 1 second before, you will take up the crown of Albion and sit the covenant, and the land will be held again, and the long open season of Dark Lords will end because the house will not be empty anymore. Her sea-gray eyes moved between them. That is what your crown costs, children. It costs you ever being only yourselves again. Tomorrow you go and find out whether you want to pay it. No one in this room will make you. That is the whole of the difference between us and the king who would not let go. And the crown itself, Hermione said, because she could not help it, because there was always one more question in her and she had stopped apologizing for it years ago. The regalia, if we are to bind a covenant one day, there has to be a crown to bind it with. Where is it? Cassiopeia looked at her a long moment, and something that was almost approval crossed her hard old face. At the old seat, she said, the true crown of Albion, gold and silver twined into a single circle, hidden since the sundering where the deepest lays cross, and not even this house knows precisely where that is any more, only that the way to it opens to both your bloods together and to nothing else alive. We have the Queen's tessera, a fragment, a promise. The crown itself you will have to find, the 2 of you, when you are grown, and it will be the most dangerous thing this family ever does, because the Dark Lord knows as well as we do that an empty throne is his open door, and he will spend everything he has left to keep that door from shutting. She rolled the genealogy closed, but that is a terror for another year. Tonight's is a train and tomorrow's is a sorting, and you will face those first, because that is the only way anyone has ever done anything large, one impossible morning at a time. And Harry, listening, understood that the throne was not a single far-off mountain but a road of them, each to be climbed in its turn, and was, on the whole, glad of it, because a road you can walk and a mountain you can only dread. What changed that last night in the tower was that the throne stopped being a family story and became a wound in the world that only the 2 of them could close, and Harry looked at the 2 branches running down to his name and Hermione's, the sun and the moon, and understood for the first time all the way down that they were not being raised toward a crown but toward a repair. Then Regulus told them his part, and his part was the dark mirror of all of it, and it was the hardest thing Harry had ever been asked to hold. He did it himself alone after the others had gone down in the small bright study with the door open a hand's width. He had asked Cassiopeia for that, to be the one to tell them, because he said it was his sin and they were old enough now, and tomorrow they walked into a world with the thing still loose in it. He sat them down. He reached under his collar and drew out, for the first time in front of Harry, the heavy gold locket he had worn against his heart for 9 years, and he set it on the desk between them, and it sat there squat and wrong and cold, an S of green stones on its face, and the lamp seemed to lean away from it. You have felt the covenant, Regulus said. The crown that wakes when you touch it, Hermione, the wards that lean toward you, Harry. That is what it looks like to bind yourself to the world out of love, a self freely given over a thing beloved, and the world holds you up forever after. He put one finger on the cold gold locket and did not flinch, though it cost him. This is what it looks like to do the opposite. This is a Horcrux. It is the blackest magic there is, and I helped a man make sense of it before I understood what it was, and I will carry that to my grave, which this thing has been trying to bring closer for 9 years. He took his finger off it. Where the covenant binds you to the land and the people out of love and his life, a Horcrux binds you to an object out of fear of death and is the murder of your own soul. You tear a piece of yourself off and you anchor it in a thing, and as long as the thing exists you cannot truly die. The tearing is done by murder. Each piece costs a life and costs you a part of your own humanity. And the Dark Lord, Harry, the one who killed your mother and father, the one whose curse you wear on your forehead, did not make one. He made several. I do not know how many. I know he believed himself the greatest sorcerer who ever lived for having done it, and I know that is why he did not die the night he turned his wand on you, and why he is not gone, whatever the ministry pretends, but lives, a torn and ruined vapor somewhere, waiting for a way back into a body. And that, said Hermione, who had gone very white and very still, looking at the locket, is one of them. You took it. I took it from a cave over the sea, out of a basin of poison, with the help of an old creature who loved me better than I deserved, and I nearly died doing it, and I have not had the courage in 9 years to destroy it, because every method I have tried it has turned aside, and because Hermione, some nights I have not been sure I wanted to, because as long as I am the one carrying it I know exactly where one of his anchors is, and that has felt, God help me, like the only useful thing I have ever done. His voice cracked and he let it. I went to him as a boy because I believed the family's creed meant blood and glory, and I learned what it really meant too late in that cave with the poison in my throat, siphon, hole. He's the most divided soul that has ever lived. He has torn himself into pieces to escape death, and there is not enough of him left in any one place to love or be loved or be a person at all. I have spent 9 years trying to become whole again so that I would have the right to ask you to help me unmake the pieces of a man who never will. He looked up, and the shame on his face was a terrible and naked thing, and he did not hide it. I am asking now. You are children, and I should not, and I am, because you are the only two people alive the covenant has chosen, and a thing made by torn love can only be unmade in the end by love that stayed whole. I have read it 40 ways. It is always the same answer. It is you too. It was always going to be you too. Harry looked at his uncle, at the locket, at Hermione's white face, and he did the thing he had done in this same room when he was 6 and did not understand, and reached out and put his hand flat over the cold gold, and this time he knew exactly what he was touching, and he did not take his hand away. Then we'll help you, Harry said. All of it, however many there are, we don't leave Uncle Reg. You taught me the word for it before you taught me what it meant. Hermione's hand came down over his, over the locket, warm over cold, the way it had over the silver 3 years before, and Regulus Black put his own 2 hands over both of theirs and bowed his head. And what changed in the small bright study was that the war stopped being the grown-ups' secret and became the children's inheritance, freely accepted, and the most divided soul in Britain acquired at last 2 whole ones set against him. The Hogwarts letters had come a fortnight earlier, by a barn owl apiece, addressed in green ink to the 2 of them at Salem Hall, and they had touched off the only real argument Harry ever heard the family have. Andromeda wanted them homeschooled. She made the case at the long table with a healer's calm and a mother's steel. The 2 most important children in 900 years, the heirs the wards had waited for, with a torn Dark Lord loose in the world who now knew they existed, and the family's answer was to put them on a train and hand them to Albus Dumbledore for 10 months a year. She would sooner hand him her wand and her front door key, and raise them where Dromeda, Sirius said, here. Behind the best wards in Britain, safe and sealed and alone, the way my mother raised me, the way Dumbledore wanted to raise Harry in a cupboard, the way every frightened powerful family has ruined every gifted child since the Sundering. They have to live in the world they're going to hold. They have to make allies in it and enemies in it and learn its shape from the inside. A king who has never been a boy at school is a king who can be told anything about the people he rules because he's never met any of them. And the heavy ring on his hand. Dumbledore's the danger, yes. He'll watch them and weigh them and try to manage them and keep his prophecy in his pocket. Let him. Better he does it where I can write to them every day and Cassiopeia can sit the board of governors and Tonks can be 3 years ahead of them in the Auror office than out in the dark where we can't see. We don't hide them. We've never hidden them. That's the whole point of us. We raise them in the light and we teach them to watch their own backs. It was Hermione who ended it, which Harry thought was right because it was her life as much as his. I want to go, she said, not to be brave, because Sirius is right, and because there's a library there I have read about for 3 years that has books this house doesn't, and because if I'm going to be a queen of these people, I am not going to be a queen who learned about them out of a book in a tower. I'm going to go and meet them. And Harry's going so I'm safe, and I'm going so he's safe, and will write to you every single day, Aunt Andromeda, and the first time it stops being safe will tell you the truth and not wrap it, because nobody in this family wraps things. She folded her letter. That's my vote, Harry. I've wanted to ride that train since I was 5, Harry said, and we don't hide, Towger's purr. We don't leave the world to the dark just because the dark S in it. He looked at Andromeda, who had taught him to stir porridge and watch hands and turn the worst things into useful tasks, and gentled it because she had earned gentleness. We'll come home for Christmas. We'll come home for every holiday. You'll be so sick of us you'll wish you'd never argued. Andromeda looked at the 2 of them, the sun and the moon, 11 years old and already speaking as one, and something went out of her shoulders, and she said, every day. You'll write every day, and if either of you so much as catches a cold, I will be through the flu before the healer, and Albus Dumbledore can explain to me personally why. And that was the family's yes, and what changed was that the children chose the world over the tower, the same choice the whole arc of the family had been bending toward, and chose it with their eyes open, which was the only kind of choosing the House of Black after 900 years had finally learned to honor. Diagon Alley was loud and golden and full of people who knew Harry's name, and the family moved through it like a fleet under sail, and Harry loved every minute of it until the wand shop went strange and the robe shop went worse. Ollivander's was the strange one. Old Wandmaker handed Harry the holly and phoenix feather that had been waiting. He said, in the curious way he said everything, and when the wand warmed in Harry's hand, Ollivander went very still and said softly that the phoenix who gave that feather had given exactly one other, and that the other was at that moment a ruin of a man hiding in a forest, and that he had wondered for 10 years which hand the brother wand would find. Then he looked at the scar on Harry's forehead and said, curious. Curious that the land should arm its king with the twin of the blade that wounded it. The old magic does love a circle, Mr. Potter. I think we may expect great and terrible things of that wand. And he had said much the same to Hermione, turning a wand of vine and dragon heartstring in his fingers as it threw out silver sparks the color of her crown, murmuring that vinewood chose owners of hidden depth and unexpected destiny, and that he had not felt a wand so pleased with itself since, well, since a very long time ago, and had looked at the two children together and said nothing more, which was somehow worse. The robe shop was where Harry met Draco Malfoy, and the Malfoys were the worst thing, because they were the rival houses made flesh. A pale, pointed, bored boy on the next stool was talking, before he knew who Harry was, about how his father said the old families ought to run things and the mudbloods ought to be grateful to be let in at all. And then Lucius Malfoy came in out of the gold afternoon with his cane and his cold and his long pale hair, and saw Sirius, and the temperature of the shop dropped 10 degrees. Lord Black, Lucius said, the house risen from its long sleep, we had heard you were raising a Potter. Not heard you were raising him alongside a Granger. His gray eyes, paler and meaner than the family's, went to Hermione and weighed her and found her. His whole face said, wanting. A Muggle girl, in the House of Black, your ancestors must be spinning in their frames. My ancestors, said Sirius pleasantly, are spinning, yes, with delight, because for the first time in 900 years this house is doing the thing it was actually for, instead of the thing small men like your father turned it. You should sit, Lucius, you've gone a funny color. It's the color of a man who's just worked out he bet the family fortune on the wrong horse and won't know how wrong for a few years yet. He put a hand on each child's shoulder, the king and the queen, and steered them toward the door, and over his shoulder, light as anything, he left the words that Harry would remember as the first shot of the war. Give my regards to your master when he gets his body back. Tell him the throne has been spoken for. Lucius Malfoy went white as his hair, because that was not a thing a sane man said in a robe shop in 1991, and Harry felt the whole Golden Street tilt toward something darker, and what changed in Diagon Alley was that the rivalry stepped out of the books and put on a face, and the face looked at Hermione the way Andromeda's mother must have looked at Ted, and Harry, 11 years old, learned that he had an enemy, and that his enemy hated the best person he knew for the accident of her blood. And decided on a sunlit street with a wand newly warm in his pocket exactly what kind of king that made him want to be. The Sorting Hat tried to split them up, and for the length of it Harry's hands would not stay still on the bench. The train had been good. They had found a compartment and been found in it by a tall red-haired boy named Ron Weasley, who did not know who Harry was for a full 10 minutes, which was so restful that Harry liked him immediately, and who knew exactly who Hermione was the moment the black name came up and was visibly terrified of her and recovered over a shared bag of chocolate frogs into something like friendship. They had repelled a corridor visit from Malfoy and his two slab-shaped friends. They had watched the castle come up out of the dark over the lake, vast and lit and impossible, and Harry had reached out without looking and found Hermione's hand, and she had squeezed it once hard, the old signal, we're here, we don't leave. And then the hat went onto Harry's head in the candlelit hall in front of the whole school and spoke into the private dark behind his eyes, and Harry understood at once that the hat knew everything. Difficult, said the small voice. Oh, very difficult. There's courage, buckets of it, and a temper and a loyalty that would walk into fire, that's plain enough. Any fool can see Gryffindor written through you like a stick of rock. But under it, oh, under it there's a crown, isn't there? I haven't felt that in 900 years. The land's own king sitting on my stool in short trousers. I could put you in Slytherin, you know, you'd be great. The old king was a Slytherin, look how that ended. Put me where I can keep her safe, Harry thought as hard as he could. And where I can be seen, we don't hide. Put me where the brave ones are so nobody ever has to wonder whose side the king is on. A pause, a sense, absurdly, of the hat being pleased. Spoken like someone who's actually been taught what a crown is for, the hat said. Most of them never learn. Very well, for her and to be seen, and because you mean it, better be Gryffindor. And then the agony of wading through the alphabet, and Harry watched Hermione walk up to the stool with her chin level and her thundercloud hair and the dead silver disc in her fist, and the hat went down over her eyes, and it took a long time, longer than his, and Harry sat at the Gryffindor table with his hands flat on the wood, and did the only thing he could, which was think at her across the hall as hard as he had ever thought anything. The way they had learned in 3 years of dueling to move as one mind in two bodies, here, over here, we don't leave. And whether she heard it or whether the hat simply saw the same thing in her that Harry had seen on a roof when she chose a double star, the brim opened and the hat shouted Gryffindor, and the table erupted and Hermione came to him through the noise and sat down hard against his side, and under the table her hand found his and gripped it, and her eyes were bright. It wanted to put me in Ravenclaw, she whispered, It said I'd learn more there. I told it I'd learn it anyway, and I wasn't being a queen of people I never sat with at breakfast. And then it said," she stopped. "It said the same thing to me it said to you, didn't it? About 900 years. "Yeah," said Harry. "It said don't let them crown you young," Hermione whispered. "It said it watched the last one. It said the only thing that broke him was being alone with it." Her grip tightened. "We're not going to be alone with it. That's the whole plan, isn't it? That's the only plan that's ever worked." What changed in the Great Hall, under 4,000 candles and a ceiling full of the same stars they had named on the roof, was that the throne came to school, hidden in plain sight under 2 red and gold ties, and the King and Queen of Albion ate their first supper in the world they would one day hold, side by side at a long loud table, 11 years old and not alone, and somewhere at the high table an old man with half-moon glasses watched the two of them lean their heads together and laugh, and did not smile. And began quietly to plan. Dumbledore sent for Harry alone in October, and the sending for told Harry more than the meeting did. Alone, that was the message inside the message. The headmaster's note asked for Mr. Potter and did not mention Miss Granger, and Harry understood it the way Andromeda had taught him to understand the things people do instead of the things they say. The old man wanted to see whether the king could be got on his own, away from the queen, because a thing you cannot separate is a thing you cannot manage. Harry went because you did not refuse the headmaster, and he went having first sat with Hermione for an hour planning exactly what he would and would not say, because that was the answer to being separated. You went into the room already 2 people. The office was beautiful and full of whirring silver instruments and a sleeping phoenix and 100 years of headmasters snoring in their frames, and Dumbledore was kind, and the kindness went all the way down, and under it the steel was waiting exactly where it had been on the moor at Arcturus's funeral. "Harry," he said over a dish of sweets Harry did not touch, "I have wanted to talk with you properly since September. I knew your parents. I find myself watching you, missing them very much. True, all of it, and aimed. I will be plain because I think you are a young man who prefers it. Your family has told you a great deal, about thrones and crowns and a destiny 900 years old. I do not doubt they have told you out of love. But I have lived a long time, Harry, and I have seen what the promise of a crown does to the young, and I carry a piece of knowledge about you, about your future, that your family does not have and that I have chosen for now not to share because you are 11 and a child should not have to carry a prophecy." "You have a prophecy about me," Harry said, "and you're not going to tell me what it says. Not yet, but you'll use it to decide things about my life." The blue eyes flickered, and Harry saw that the shot had landed, and saw the old man recalculate, and saw, for one moment, the loneliness under the steel, under the kindness. 3 layers down, an old wizard who had been managing other people's destinies so long he had forgotten there was another way to love a child. "I will use it," Dumbledore said gently, "to try to keep you alive. That is all I have ever wanted for you, whatever your family believes. To keep you alive, and if I can, good, which is harder and matters more." He folded his hands. "They are raising you toward a throne. I am asking you to leave a door open in your own mind to the possibility that they are wrong, that the kindest thing anyone could do for Harry Potter is to make sure he never has to wear a crown at all. Will you leave that door open, only in your mind? It is all I ask." And Harry, who had been taught by a dying lord that power given is a debt and power taken is a theft, and by a fierce old woman that the words on the walls meant you don't leave, and by his own godfather that a sign the old magic leaves is a thing to read and not to flee, looked at the most isolated, powerful man in Britain and gave him an honest answer, which was not the answer the old man wanted and was better. "I'll leave the door open if you will," Harry said. "You leave open the door that they're right. That the throne's not a cliff, it's a repair, and that the reason you're scared of it isn't that crowns go bad, it's that the last one that didn't go bad would have made the ministry pointless and you with it. I'll doubt my family if you'll doubt yourself. That's fair. That's actually fair, sir. Aunt Cass says you're the cleverest man in Britain, so you'll know it's fair." He stood. "Thank you for the sweets. I didn't eat them, no offense. We don't eat things in rooms where someone wants to manage us. Andromeda taught me that too." He left the old man sitting among his whirring instruments, and what changed in the headmaster's office was that Dumbledore had reached for the king alone and found, instead, 2 children wearing one face, and had understood finally that the House of Black had done the one thing he had not believed they were capable of, which was to raise an heir who could not be separated from the people he loved, and that this made him either the safest king in 900 years or the most dangerous, and that he, Albus Dumbledore, did not yet know which, and would have to watch and wait and keep his prophecy in his pocket a while longer. They came home for Christmas, as promised, and Christmas at Salem Hall undid in 3 days everything the year had been quietly winding tight. There was the porridge the first morning and a third stool now beside the 2, because Ron Weasley had been folded into a family invitation by an Andromeda who could not bear the thought of a boy spending the holiday with his own large warm family when he could be spending it being interrogated by hers. And there was the goose, which Sirius burned on purpose so the smoke alarm portrait could shriek and they could all roar at it together, a ritual 9 years deep now and dearer for it. There was Cassiopeia teaching Ron to play wizard chess and being beaten once by accident, and declaring him the most dangerous fool she had met in 50 years, which from Cassiopeia was a knighthood. There were the wards walked at dusk in the snow, the whole loud crowd of them, even Ted, who still could not feel a ward if it bit him, and walked them anyway, because that was the point, you walked them together. And there was the roof. The first truly clear night, Harry took Hermione up onto the lead behind the eastern gable, where the iron rail was charmed soft, and the moor lay white and silver under the cold, and the patient amber star was exactly where it was supposed to be in the east, and overhead Spica burned, the double that looked like one. Hermione had a present for him, wrapped badly because she could no more wrap a parcel than cook a goose. It was a chart. Hand-drawn, months of work in it, every star she had catalogued in 3 years of roofs, the family names and the real names both, and at the center, circled his own, the patient one, still labeled only in her neat hand with a question mark and a note, name pending. Subject refuses to hurry. I'm not giving up, she said, drawing her knees under her chin. On finding the name, you said you'd know it when you had something to hang it on. So I'm keeping the chart, and every clear night I'm going to look, and the day you finally work out what to hang it on, I'll have the whole sky ready so we can put it exactly where it belongs. She bumped his shoulder with hers. That's my Christmas present, patience, which Sirius says is your kind of star, so it fits. It's the best present I've ever got, Harry said, and meant it, and they sat on the cold roof under the given star and the chosen one, while down below the house was loud and gold and full of people who loved them. And the locket slept in a warded box in the tower, and the wraith brooded in its forest, and Malfoy plotted in his manor, and none of it for 3 days could get in. That was what the family was for. That was the thing Sirius had taught them as a discipline, to set the weight down on purpose, and they set it down, and what changed over Christmas was nothing, gloriously nothing, except that the two of them learned, against all the gathering dark, that the home was load-bearing too, that it would hold. And they carried that certainty back to school in January like a coal kept warm in cupped hands, and it was, more than any spell, the thing that got them down the trapdoor in June and back up again alive. The brush with the thing in the forest came at the very end of the year, underground in the dark, and it was the first time Harry stood in the same room as the murderer of his mother and father. It had been building all year, and they had read it building, because they had been raised by people who taught them to read. Something was loose in the castle. The scar ached on the nights the wraith fed. A teacher with a stammer and a turban smelled faintly of the same wrongness that had pressed against the wards of Selim Hall when Harry was 7. And under the school the children worked out, with Hermione's method and Harry's nerve and a great deal of help from Ron Weasley's loyal terror, lay a thing the headmaster was guarding, a stone that made the maker deathless, the exact thing a torn and bodiless soul would crawl across the country to reach. They did not go down to be heroes. They went down because the wards of the school were thinning. They could both feel it, the silver disc gone cold in Hermione's pocket and the scar gone hot, and because Harry had written to Sirius and Cassiopeia were even now hammering at the headmaster's wards from outside trying to get in, and because waiting in a tower while the dark came up out of the ground was the one thing the House of Black had sworn never to do again. They went down together. They were always going to go down together. And at the bottom, in front of a mirror that showed the heart's deep want, stood the stammering teacher, and when he unwound his turban there was a face on the back of his head, flat and white and snake-nostriled, a ruin of a face, the most divided soul that had ever lived, wearing another man like a coat, and it looked at the two children with red eyes, and it knew them. The sun, it hissed in a voice like dry leaves, and the moon, together, as my servant told me you would be. The blood that means to hold the land against me. Do you know, child, what you are? Do you know what your crown would cost me? The empty throne is the open door through which I will walk back into the world, and you, the two of you, you mean to close it. The whole white face strained toward them. Quirrell, take them. The Dark Lord wishes to look upon the heirs of Albion before he unmakes them. What saved them was not power. They had none at 11 against that. What saved them was the thing the family had spent 10 years building, the thing Dumbledore had reached into the office to break and could not. They did not freeze, and they did not scatter. Harry went straight at the throat because that was his gift, drawing every eye and every curse onto himself, loud and bright and impossible to ignore, the king making himself the target on purpose. And in the half-second that bought Hermione, who saw 3 moves past everyone, who had been turning the silver disc over in her cold fingers since the stairs, did the thing she had worked out somewhere on the way down, and pressed the queen's tessera flat against the stone floor of the chamber, against the rotting ward of the school, and woke it. The moonline touched the wards of Britain, even here, even this small, thin underground piece of them, and for 3 seconds the silver crown blazed up out of the floor around the 2 children, a circle of moonlight, the covenant answering its queen 900 years early, and the thing on the back of Quirrell's head screamed, because the one magic in all the world it could not abide was the magic of the land held and loved, the exact opposite of the torn, cold thing it had made of itself. It was not a victory. The wraith fled, tearing itself free of the dying Quirrell and pouring away through the dark, and the stone was lost to it that night by an inch, and Dumbledore came down at last through his own broken wards to find two 11-year-olds standing in a fading circle of moonlight over an empty mirror, alive together, the king's hand in the queen's, and the look on the old man's face was the most honest thing Harry had ever seen there. But it was a beginning. The thing in the forest had looked on the heirs of Albion, and the heirs of Albion had looked back and not broken, and what changed in the dark under the school was that the war Regulus had handed them as an inheritance became, at last, a thing they had felt on their own skin. The cold red eyes, the dry leaf voice, the naming of the stakes. Close the door and he is finished. Leave it open and he walks back in. And the only door in all of Britain that could be shut against him was a throne, and the only two people alive who could shut it were holding hands on the cold stone floor, 11 years old, breathing hard and entirely unwilling to let go. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, Bannermen and Rivals. By the time Harry was 14, the war had two fronts, and the one fought with parchment frightened him more than the one fought with wands, because Hermione understood it, and Hermione, that winter, looked grim. The years between had not been idle. There had been the business in their second year, the thing in the pipes, a diary that bled when you wrote in it, and a memory of a 16-year-old Tom Riddle climbing up out of its pages toward a body. And Harry had put a fang through the diary in a flooded chamber while Hermione held the wraith of young Riddle at bay with a circle of moonlight from the tessera, and the diary had screamed and died, and Regulus, when they brought him the ruined book, had sat down hard and gone grey and said, "That is one of them, that is one of his anchors dead. You have destroyed a Horcrux between you at the age of 12, and you do not yet understand what you have done." They had understood later. One down. A handful left and no map of them. There had been a third year of quieter things, of dueling clubs. Cassiopeia ran by outpost and a great deal of law, and now there was the writ. "It is called the Sovereign's Writ," Hermione said, at the long table at Salem Hall over the Christmas of their fourth year, with parchment spread the length of it, and Sirius and Cassiopeia and Regulus listening, because she had built the thing and it was hers to present. "It's the oldest instrument in our law, and nobody has been able to use it for 900 years because nobody had standing. It's the mechanism by which the old houses acknowledge the crown. Not a coronation. A coronation needs the regalia and the covenant and the seat, and we're years off that, and it would get us killed now. The writ is smaller, and it's legal, and it's lethal in a different way." She set her finger on a line of old script. "When a sovereign claim is laid, any head of an ancient house may answer it, by ritual, with a binding oath of fealty. It costs them nothing to refuse. But here is the part the ministry has forgotten, because the ministry has spent 9 centuries pretending the crown is a fairy tale. Every oath sworn to true claim wakes a thread of the old wards. House by house, oath by oath, the land starts to remember it has a sovereign. And the ministry's authority, Harry, every scrap of it, exists only in the gap the empty throne left behind. The more houses swear, the smaller the ministry's gap. We don't have to fight them. We have to make them irrelevant, one ancient oath at a time, and they will feel it happening and be able to do nothing legal to stop it, because the writ is older than every law they could use against it." Cassiopeia looked at the girl she had found in a Crawley parish register and let a breath out slowly. "She is better at this than I am," she said to no one. "I have wanted to use the writ for 90 years, and I never once saw that you do not need the throne to begin. You only need the oaths, house by house." She put her old hand flat on the parchment. "It will start a war, child. The moment the first great house kneels, the Dark Lord's people will understand that the throne is no longer empty and waiting but filling in fact, and the empty throne is the door he means to walk back through, and he will move to shut us down before the wards wake enough to lock that door. You understand that? You are proposing we light the fuse on purpose." "I'm proposing we stop waiting to be attacked and start making them attack us on our schedule in the open, where the law and the wards are on our side," Hermione said. "Sirius taught us, you don't hide, you raise them in the light." She did not look at Harry. She did not need to. They had argued the whole of it through on the roof for a week before she ever spread a sheet of parchment. "And there's one more thing the writ does that matters more than the wards. Right now Harry and I are a rumor. A Potter and a Granger the Blacks are raising, and people whisper crown and laugh. The first time a real head of house kneels and swears fealty to the two of us in front of witnesses by a ritual nobody can fake, we stop being a rumor. We become a fact with armies. And facts with armies do not get quietly murdered in their beds. They get fought in the open, where we are very, very good." She squared the parchment. "I've found our first house. They're old, they're proud, they've hated the ministry since before the war, and their head owes this family a debt 3 generations deep. If we ask correctly, they'll swear. And once one swears, the others have to decide which side of the line they were always going to be on." What changed at the long table at Christmas was that the House of Black stopped keeping faith in secret and began to spend it in public, and Harry watched the girl he had met on a roof lay out a campaign to wake a kingdom one oath at a time, and understood that whatever the old magic had meant by a queen, it had not meant an ornament, and felt, looking at her, something the family had no word for and the old tongue had several. The first house swore in February, in the ruined hall of their own ancient seat, and the second front of the war opened before the oath was cold. House Greengrass was old and gray and northern, and its head was a hard woman named Aurelia who had buried a husband to Voldemort's people in the last war and trusted no one since, and she made Harry and Hermione stand in the wreck of her hall for 2 hours and answer questions before she would consider it. She asked Hermione the law, and Hermione gave it to her cold and exact. She asked Harry what he would do as king when an oathed house did a wrong thing and the crown was bound to that house by fealty. And Harry, who had been raised by a dying lord on the difference between debt and theft, said that fealty went both ways, that a house that swore to him bought a king who owed it justice, and that the first time he used a sworn house as a tool instead of serving it as a sovereign, the Greengrasses should consider their oath void and his crown forfeit, and that he would put that in the writ in his own hand if she liked. Aurelia Greengrass looked at the 14-year-old for a long moment, and then she knelt on the cracked stone of her own hall and laid her wand across her palms and swore, and the old words rose up between them, and far away under the snow a thread of the wards of Britain that had slept 900 years woke and pulled taut and hummed. Harry felt it wake, so did Hermione, the tessera warming in her fist. And so, 200 miles south in a tower full of whirring instruments, did Albus Dumbledore, and so, in a forest where a ruin of a soul brooded over its long return, did the thing that had once been a man. The ministry's answer arrived within the week, and it wore a cardigan. Her name was Dolores Umbridge, and she was the minister's blade dressed as his secretary, and she came to Hogwarts that spring as the ministry's appointed observer, which everyone understood to mean the ministry's appointed weapon against 2 students who had become, over a single February, the most dangerous people in Britain. She could not touch the writ was older than her office. So she went after the children instead with the whole soft machinery of bureaucracy, 1,000 small cruelties wrapped in pink, new rules, new decrees, detentions designed to break, a quill that wrote in the user's own blood. She set out methodically to make Harry Potter's life at Hogwarts a slow agony, on the theory that a king who could be made to suffer could be made to stop, and she had broken stronger people than a 14-year-old, and she was patient, and she was protected by the law she served. She had not understood what she was facing, which was not a 14-year-old, it was a house. The night the blood quill drew its first line down the back of Harry's hand, Harry wrote home, because he did not hide things from his family. That was the whole point of his family. He did not write to ask for rescue. He wrote because Andromeda had taught him that a child who keeps his hurts secret grows into an adult who cannot be helped. And the House of Black answered the way the House of Black answered everything, which was completely. Cassiopeia took her seat on the Board of Governors, which she had held in abeyance for 40 years, and made Umbridge's professional life a study in friction. Tonks, 3 years into the Auror office, quietly opened a file on the misuse of a dark artifact against a minor, and let it be known the file existed. And Sirius Lord Black wrote Dolores Umbridge a single letter, courteous and brief, observing that he understood she was using a blood quill on his son and heir, that the artifact in question was classed as dark, that its use on a minor was a criminal matter, and that he was a patient man with excellent lawyers and a long memory, and that she should consider carefully whether the minister who was protecting her today would still be protecting her on the day the throne she was trying to strangle in its cradle finished waking. He copied the letter to 9 newspapers. Umbridge was recalled to London within the month, and what changed that spring was the discovery, by every house watching, that the children could not be got at sideways, that a blow against one of them brought down the whole 900-year weight of a house that had decided, finally, what it was for. And the houses that had been waiting to see whether the black claim was a rumor or a power watched a ministry blade break itself on 2 teenagers and a family, and began quietly to write to Selim Hall, asking the terms of an oath. The ministry, having failed to break the children, tried next to break the law that protected them, and that fight happened in the deep chamber under London where the Wisengamot sat, and Harry watched his family win it without raising a wand. Cornelius Fudge could not arrest a 14-year-old for being the subject of an old ritual, but he could, his lawyers assured him, legislate. So the ministry tabled an emergency decree, the Preservation of Magical Governance Act, 3 feet of parchment whose single working sentence declared the sovereign's writ a relic of a superseded order, void and of no legal force, its use henceforth a crime against the state. It was clever. It was, the ministry's people thought, airtight. And Sirius Black took his hereditary seat on the Wisengamot for the first time in a decade, specifically to let them table it, because the family had wanted them to. Let them write it, Hermione had said, a week before, spreading the draft they had obtained across the long table. Let them put it to a vote. Because to void the writ they have to name it, and to name it they have to define it, and the moment they define it in their own statute they create a record in their own law of exactly what it is and how old it is, and Sirius, look what it is. The writ is the instrument by which the old houses acknowledge the crown. The Wisengamot is the council those same houses formed by that same writ's authority to govern in the crown's absence. The writ is the Wisengamot's own birth certificate. If they vote to declare the writ void and of no force, they vote in the same breath to dissolve the legal basis of their own assembly. They can't void it. The hand can't amputate the arm it's growing out of. All we have to do is be in the room when they try and make them say it out loud. So they were in the room. Harry and Hermione sat in the visitors' gallery, 14 and 15, in plain dark robes, and watched Cornelius Fudge rise to introduce a decree that would erase them, and watched Sirius Black wait, courteous and idle, turning the lordship ring on his finger, until the precise moment the minister asked the chamber to declare the sovereign's writ void and of no legal force whatsoever. And then Sirius stood and asked, mildly, a single procedural question. Under what authority did this chamber claim the power to void an instrument of law? And the ministry's council, who had prepared for a fight about thrones and fairy tales, answered because he had to, that the Wisengamot derived its authority from the founding compact of the great houses. And Sirius asked, still mildly, whether learned counsel could produce that founding compact for the chamber's inspection, and the compact was produced because the law required it. And it was of course an instrument of the sovereign's writ, the very thing the chamber was being asked to declare null, signed 900 years ago by the same houses, under the same authority, in the same hand. It was Hermione's checkmate, made a year before over a stolen draft, and it landed in the deep chamber like a dropped stone. To kill the writ, the Wisengamot would have to unmake itself. Half the chamber understood it at once and went pale. The other half understood it when Lucius Malfoy, who had a seat and a vote and a master to please, rose smoothly to argue that ancient instruments could be set aside by modern necessity, and was asked by a bored Sirius Black whether he wished his own seat set aside by the same principle, since he held it by the identical authority, and sat back down with his jaw working. The decree was withdrawn before it came to vote, because a government cannot pass a law that abolishes the government, and what changed in the deep chamber under London was that the ministry learned, in front of the whole Wisengamot, that the throne could not be killed with parchment, that the children were defended by a wall of law older than the men who wanted them gone, and that anyone who meant to stop the House of Black would have to step outside the law to do it, into the dark. Where the Dark Lord was already waiting, and where the family had been preparing to fight all along. The victory had a price the law did not name, and Harry paid it in a corridor that night and nearly got it wrong, and Hermione set him right, which was the shape the two of them were learning to be. The papers had been at them for a year, and after the Wisengamot they were worse. There were drawings of him now, of both of them, a boy king and his muggle queen, some adoring and some vicious, and there were strangers in Hogsmeade who knelt when Harry passed and strangers who spat, and there was the particular weight of walking into the great hall every morning and feeling 400 faces decide again what you were. Harry hated it. He had been raised on a roof to find one patient star in a crowded sky and be no one's spectacle, and now he could not buy a quill without it being an event. And the night after the Wisengamot he came back to the common room wound too tight and said something short and ugly to Hermione about how easy it was for her, how she loved the law and the cleverness and the winning, how she had built the whole campaign that put their faces on every front page in Britain. And how he had never once been asked whether he wanted to be a poster. She did not flinch and she did not soften it. She put down her book. "You think I want my face on a poster," she said. "I was a muggle dentist's daughter who read too much and had no friends, Harry, and now half this country thinks I'm a jumped-up mudblood who seduced their king and the other half thinks I'm a saint, and neither one of them is a person, and I can't walk to charms without being one or the other. You think the gallery's easy for me. I built the campaign because it was the only way to keep us alive and to make Ted's Lane the last lane, and I built it knowing exactly what it would cost me, and I did it anyway because that's the job, because somebody has to see 3 moves ahead and act while the brave fool is still being brave, your aunt's words, not mine." Her voice did not rise. It went quieter, which was worse. "And the one thing, the only thing, that was going to make it bearable was that I wasn't going to be in the gallery alone, so don't you dare make me the enemy because the country did this to both of us. We don't leave. You taught me that on a roof when we were 7. Did you mean it only when it was easy?" The corridor was very quiet. Harry looked at her, at the girl who had woken a crown at 8 and a kingdom's law at 14, and was carrying every ounce of it that he was, in a measure he had never once thought to count, and the wound-tight thing in him let go all at once, and he dropped his eyes from hers and then dragged them back up because his family did not look away from what they had done. "I meant it," he said. "I'm sorry. That was Malfoy's line, not mine, the blood thing. I let them put their words in my mouth and I aimed them at you, which is exactly what they want. It's the whole strategy, split the sun off from the moon. Aunt Cass warned us." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'm not the brave fool out front and you're not the clever one safe in the back. I know that. We're a left hand and a right. I forgot it for an hour because I was tired and they got to me. It won't happen again. Find your star." It was the old thing, the thing from the roof, the thing they said when it had gone dark. Hermione looked at him a moment longer, and then she let it go all at once and completely and picked her book back up. "Find your star," she said. "Sit down. We've got defense in the morning, and you're hopeless at the theory, and I'm not carrying you through another esque at breakfast." And he sat down beside her, and the country could draw what it liked, and what changed in the corridor was that the two of them learned the single most dangerous thing an enemy could do to a sovereign pair, and learned it in time to be proof against it forever. That you did not have to defeat the King and Queen of Albion, you only had to turn the one against the other, and that the House of Black had raised exactly two people who would not be turned. They destroyed the locket in the spring of that year, and it nearly took Regulus with it, and it was the night the war stopped being political and became personal in blood. It had to be the three of them. Regulus had read it 40 ways, and the answer never changed. A Horcrux is a soul torn out of love of self and fear of death, and the only thing that unmakes it cleanly, without the basilisk venom butchery that had killed the diary, is its opposite poured in until the thing cannot bear to exist, a self freely given over a thing beloved. The covenant magic, the very thing Harry and Hermione carried in their blood. And Regulus, who had carried the locket against his heart for 11 years, had to be the one to open it, because it was his sin and his penance, and because the locket knew him and would lower its guard for the one who had loved it enough to steal it and hate it enough to keep it. They did it in the tower, under the window full of stars, with the family ringed around them and Andromeda standing by with everything in her dispensary. Regulus opened the locket. The thing inside it came out as it had come for the diary, a column of cold green smoke that took a shape, and the shape it took was not young Tom Riddle, but a thing built to break Regulus specifically. It showed him the cave and the creature that had died for him in the poison, and it told him in his master's voice that he was a coward and a traitor twice over, traitor to the dark and then traitor to his own redemption, that he had carried the locket 11 years not out of penance but out of cowardice, unable to destroy it and unable to die, the most divided soul in the room, just like its maker. And Regulus, who had believed exactly this about himself for 11 years, began to come apart. "It's lying," Hermione said, fast, gripping the tessera. "Harry, it's doing to him what it did to Riddle. It's not just defending itself, it's trying to make him hold the wrong way round. It's trying to pour his own self-hatred back into him until there's a tier it can climb into. We have to do it now, we have to do it before it finishes. Reg." Harry took his uncle by both shoulders, between Regulus and the green smoke thing wearing his master's voice. "Uncle Reg, look at me, siphon. You taught me the word before you taught me what it meant. Whole, you are not divided. You spent 11 years carrying the worst thing in the world next to your heart so you'd always know where one of his doors was, and that's not cowardice. That's the bravest thing anybody in this family has ever done, and I'd swear it on the throne. You came out of the cave, you came back, you don't leave, you taught me that too." He did not let go. "Now you're going to pour it in, not your hate, your love. The thing you'd give your life for, on 3, you're not alone in it, you're never alone in it. That's the whole plan, and it's the only one that's ever worked." And Regulus Black looked at the child he had taught the old tongue to in a study with the door held open a hand's width, and stopped listening to the voice of the thing that had ruined his youth, and reached past his own 11 years of self-hatred for the one clean thing he had built out of the wreck, which was this family, these 2 children, the work of keeping faith. And he poured it into the locket, a self freely given over a thing beloved, and Harry put his hand over Regulus's hand and Hermione put hers over both and woke the tessera. And the covenant came up around the 3 of them in a tower full of weeping portraits, sun and moon and the penitent between them, and the locket of Salazar Slytherin could not bear to exist in the presence of that much undivided love and tore itself open and screamed and died. Regulus collapsed. For a moment Andromeda could not find his pulse, and Harry's whole world narrowed to her hands on his uncle's chest, and then the pulse came back, thready and then strong, and Regulus opened his eyes. And the thing that had lived in them for 11 years, the hollow haunted weight, was simply gone, burned out with the Horcrux, and he looked up at the 2 children bent over him and he wept, and it was not the old wound, it was the other thing, the clean thing, and he said, "Siphon, I'm whole. I haven't been whole since I was 19 years old. What did you do to me?" And Harry, who had one named feeling left in him that night and spent it, said, "Nothing, you did it. We just didn't leave," and the family closed over the 3 of them on the tower floor, and 2 of Voldemort's anchors were dead, and the war had its first true victory. It also had its answer. Because the destruction of the locket sent a shock down whatever black thread still bound the Dark Lord to his anchors, and in his forest the ruin of a soul felt a second door slam shut, and understood, finally and exactly, that the children of Albion were not merely claiming a throne to spite him, but systematically destroying the very thing that kept him in the world, and resolved, that night, to stop waiting for a perfect return and take an imperfect one at once. Before the heirs could find the rest of his soul and lock him out of life forever, he came back in June, in a graveyard, by the hand of the traitor Sirius had once chosen a crying baby over, and the cost of his return was paid by the House of Black. They had not known it would be that night. They had been told by Regulus's slow reconstruction of his master's old plans that a return was coming and would need three things: a bone, a servant's flesh, an enemy's blood, and they had been hunting the where and the when for months. What they had not reckoned was Peter Pettigrew, who had spent 13 years as a rat in hiding precisely because Sirius had once turned away from revenge to lift a screaming child out of a ruined cot, and who now crept back into the story to pay his master's price. And what they had not reckoned was that the blood the ritual wanted, the enemy's blood, the blood of the one the Dark Lord most feared, was Harry's, and that Pettigrew would come to Salem Hall to take it. He could not get through the wards. No servant of the Dark Lord could. The wards were black wards, ancient and woven, and they had held against worse than Peter Pettigrew. So Pettigrew did the thing the desperate do, and went for the weak point, which was never the children and never the walls, but the people who went in and out of them on the ordinary errands of an ordinary life. He took Ted Tonks on the lane below the moor on a Tuesday, coming back from the village with the post, an unarmed muggle-born who had never hurt a living soul and could not feel a ward if it bit him, and he used Ted's blood because any blood of the household carried enough of the ward's signature to fool the ritual, and he left Ted in the lane and he fled to his master with his stolen vial. They found Ted at dusk. Andromeda found him. Harry would carry the sound she made the rest of his life and would never once describe it to anyone. Ted Tonks did not die for a throne or a prophecy or 900 years of anything. He died because he had married a black woman who loved him and had been folded gently into a family that walked the wards together at dusk even though he could never feel them, and because a coward needed a household's blood and his was nearest the gate. He was the kindest man Harry had ever known after Sirius, the other muggle-raised soul who rolled his eyes with Hermione's parents, the one who had taught Harry that you could belong to magic completely without having a drop of it in you. And he was gone in a lane on a Tuesday, and the Dark Lord rose that night in a far graveyard wearing a body bought with Ted Tonks's blood, and the two halves of the war came together at last into one black thing, and what changed was that the House of Black, which had taught its children for 9 years to set the weight down and live on purpose, learned again the old lesson it had hoped its children would never have to learn, which was that faith costs and that you do not get to keep the people you love. You only get to be worthy of having had them. They buried Ted on the moor, beside Arcturus, under a sky that for once Harry could not bear to look up into. Tonks did not change her hair for a month. Andromeda did not turn her grief into a list of useful tasks, not this time, not for a long time, and Harry sat with her in the kitchen through the worst of the nights and stirred the porridge himself because someone had to and because Ted would have wanted the mornings kept, and that was the only useful task there was. And on the third night in the worst of it, Hermione found Harry on the roof, where he had gone to be where the stars were even though he hated them now, and she did not say anything comforting because she did not wrap things and neither did he. She sat down against his side on the cold lid and put the tessera in his hand, silver and warm, and said, "He's going to do this again, whoever's nearest the gate, until we shut the door. The only way to make Ted the last one is to finish it, Harry. The throne isn't a story or a repair anymore. It's the only thing that stops the next lane and the next Tuesday." She laced her fingers through his around the warm silver. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be all right. It isn't all right, but we don't leave. Not him, not each other, not the people by the gate. We finish it together. That's the whole plan." "That's the whole plan," Harry said into the dark and meant it like a vow. And what changed on the roof on the third night after Ted Tonks died was that two children stopped being raised toward a crown and started, grimly and entirely, to reach for it. The houses came after that in the black weeks of Voldemort's open return, and they came for the worst and truest reason, which was that the dark had finally come close enough to touch them, and the House of Black took them anyway, because a sovereign does not get to choose the season in which people decide they need a king. It happened the way Hermione had said it would a year before over Christmas parchment. The Dark Lord was embodied now, and gathering, and the ministry under Fudge did the thing frightened governments do and denied it, called the witnesses liars, called the murders accidents, and offered the country nothing but the comfort of a closed eye. And into that silence the news of the sovereign's writ ran like water into a crack, that there was another power old and legal and waking, that two children of Albion had broken a ministry blade and destroyed two of the Dark Lord's anchors and woken 100 threads of the deep wards, and that the great houses who swore to them were finding their ancient seats warded as they had not been warded in 9 centuries, safe, while the unsworn lay open to the dark. So they came. House Greengrass had been first, in February, out of debt and judgment. The houses that came in the black summer came with the dark already at their heels, and they came fast. Old, proud, frightened families who had watched the last war and could not survive another, and who looked at the empty silence where the ministry should have been, and at the waking wards around the sworn houses, and made the arithmetic any parent makes. Bone by bone the kingdom remembered its spine. Each oath woke another length of the wards. Each waking ward made the next house's choice easier and the Dark Lord's return harder, and somewhere in his gathering dark he felt the land closing against him a thread at a time, and threw everything he had into the hunt for the heirs, and could not reach them, because every house that swore put another 200 miles of waking wards between the children and the gate. The convocation came at the autumn equinox in the great hall of Selim Hall, and it was the nearest thing to a court Albion had seen in 900 years. 11 heads of ancient houses and the greengrass woman who had been first, and the family ranged behind the 2 children at the foot of the great staircase under the window full of stars, and Cassiopeia Black, 90 years a keeper, standing where she had stood the night a baby first crossed the threshold, her hand on the old genealogy. And Harry Potter and Hermione Granger, 14 and 15, in no crowns and no thrones, only the plain dark clothes of a household in mourning, stood and received the fealty of a third of magical Britain, oath by oath, the old words rising and the wards answering, and the whole hall ringing with a power not felt since the sundering. When it was done, when the last house had sworn, Cassiopeia stepped forward, and her dry old voice filled the hall as it had filled it for a sleeping infant 900 years of waiting before. "Hear me," she said, "these are not your sovereigns yet, mark it. They wear no crown, they sit no throne, the covenant is not bound and will not be bound until they are grown and willing, and the regalia is whole and the seat is won, and any house that swore tonight expecting a king it could use has sworn to the wrong children, and may go. No house moved. You have sworn to claim and to 2 people and to a promise this house has kept for 900 years and means to keep to the end, that the throne of Albion is 2 thrones held by equals, who love their people enough to be bound to them and each other enough never to wear the whole crown alone, so that what fell at the sundering can never fall again. The Dark Lord wants the throne empty, because an empty throne is the door he climbs through. We are going to fill it, not for power, to shut the door. And every one of you who swore tonight has chosen at last the side this family chose 9 centuries ago, which is the side of the held land and the loved people and the unbroken faith." Towger's purr. Her sea-gray eyes swept the hall and the watching dead in their frames, always faithful, welcome to the war. And the 11 houses and the one that had been first answered her, the old answer, the answer the portraits had made over a sleeping baby and would make again over a crown, a sound like wind down a long gallery, like the sea heard far inland. And what changed at the autumn equinox was that the throne of Albion stopped being a claim and became a cause with armies. And Harry stood in the ringing hall with Hermione's hand in his and the wards of half a kingdom waking at his back, and looked across the crowd to where his uncle Regulus stood whole and his godfather stood ringed and his aunt Andromeda stood, for the first time in months, with something other than grief in her face, and understood that the door Ted had died beside could be shut, would be shut, and that the cost of shutting it was only just beginning to be counted. That night when the houses had gone and the hall was dark, the family climbed to the tower, because the tower was where they did the hard arithmetic, and Cassiopeia laid out on the desk what stood between them and a shut door. 3 things, she said, we have begun the first. The houses are swearing and the wards are waking, and that is the army and the law, and it is well in hand, but oaths do not crown a sovereign. For that we need the second thing, the regalia, the true crown of Albion, the gold and silver twined, and it has been hidden since the sundering at the old seat, and not even this house knows precisely where the old seat is any more, only that it lies where the deepest lays cross and that the way to it opens to the blood of both lines together and to nothing else. We will have to find it, and the third thing, her old finger touched the genealogy. We cannot crown them into a held land while the Dark Lord still has anchors in the world, because a covenant bound over a poisoned country binds the poison too. We have killed the diary and the locket. There are more. Regulus has begun the map. Regulus did not answer at once. He had been looking the whole while not at the desk but at Harry, at the scar on Harry's forehead, with an expression that turned the air in the tower cold, and when he spoke his voice was careful in the way that frightened Harry more than shouting would have. There are at least 3 left that I can name, Regulus said. The cup, the diadem, the serpent he keeps close now that he is embodied. And there is a 4th I have suspected for a year and have not let myself write down, because if I am right it is the worst thing this family has ever had to face, worse than the cave, worse than Ted. His eyes did not leave the scar. The night he came for you, Harry, his curse failed and a piece of his soul came loose with no anchor prepared to catch it. I have read what happens to a torn piece of soul with no vessel. It goes into the nearest living thing. He stopped. He made himself finish because the family did not wrap things. You have spoken parcel tongue in your sleep since you were 6. You feel him through that scar. I think there is a reason the Wraith called you the door, and I think it is not only the throne he meant. I think when we come at last to count his anchors, we are going to find that one of them is asleep 2 floors below us, and has been since before he could talk, and I do not yet know what we do about that, and I would give the rest of my whole life not to be right. The tower was silent. Hermione's hand found Harry's in the dark, hard, the old grip, and Harry stood under the window full of stars with the scar gone cold on his forehead and understood all at once why his uncle had looked at him like that all evening, and what changed on the night of the convocation, in the hour of the family's first great victory, was that the war set its last and worst price on the table where they could all see it. And the King of Albion learned that the final door that might have to be shut against the Dark Lord could turn out to be himself. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The empty throne. Harry was 17 the winter the war came indoors, and Albus Dumbledore arrived at Salem Hall on a January night with his right hand black to the wrist and 3 months to live, and that was the night the last of the old man's masks came off. The 2 years since Ted had been a long, grinding dark. The Dark Lord was embodied and open now, and the ministry had fallen to him from the inside the way rotten governments fall, all at once and quietly, and the only authority left standing in Britain that he could not corrupt or kill was the waking ring of sworn houses around 2 teenagers, because you cannot bribe a ward and you cannot imperious the land. So the war had become a siege. The sworn houses held their warded seats, the unsworn fell or fled or turned, and at the center, at Salem Hall behind the deepest wards in Britain, the House of Black held the King and Queen of Albion and counted its dead and did not break. They did not break because they had been built, year on year, not to. The mornings still happened, even under siege, even with the ministry fallen and the sky some days the color of a bruise. Andromeda still came down first and made the porridge, because a house that let the war make its porridge had forgotten how to be a home, and there were 4 stools now, and one of them stayed empty for Ted, and no one ever moved it. Sirius still burned the Sunday roast on purpose. The wards were still walked at dusk, by fewer of them now and in armor, but walked together. They buried allies on the moor beside Arcturus and Ted, one and then another, the head of a sworn house cut down on her own threshold, a greengrass cousin, 2 of Tonks's fellow Aurors who had refused the new regime. And each grave taught the same lesson the family had been learning for 17 years, that faith costs and that you keep it anyway, and each grave made the 2 heirs at the center quieter and harder and more certain of what the shut door was worth. Harry had grown tall in those 2 years and quiet under the noise, and Hermione had grown into the cold, clear command the old magic had always meant by a queen, and the 2 of them had stopped being children so gradually that no one had marked the day, and over all of it, every hour of it, hung the thing Regulus had named in the tower. The scar, the door, the piece of the enemy asleep behind Harry's eyes. Dumbledore came through the wards because Cassiopeia let him, and he came alone, and when Andromeda took his cloak in the great hall and saw the hand, the ruined blackened hand, she put him in a chair by the fire with a healer's speed and a daughter's hard quiet and said, "Who did this to you and why did you let them?" And Dumbledore smiled at her with the old total kindness and said, "I did it to myself, my dear, reaching for a thing I should have asked for help to reach. It is a very old failing of mine. I am rather come to the end of it tonight." He had found the ring. That was the first thing he told them, all of them, gathered in the hall, Sirius and Andromeda and Regulus and Cassiopeia, and the 2 heirs and Tonks come in from the cold with her hair gone gray at the temples at 24. He had found the gaunt ring, one of the Dark Lord's anchors, hidden in a ruined shack, and he had destroyed it, and it had carried a curse built to kill whoever broke it, and the curse was in his blood now and could be slowed and not stopped, and he had 3 months, perhaps less. 3 of his anchors gone, Dumbledore said. The diary, which I know you 2 destroyed at 12, and which told me more about what you are than a year of watching. The locket, which I felt die in the spring and grieved for Regulus, knowing what it must have cost, and now the ring. I have spent my last good years on the same hunt you have, from the other end, and I came here tonight, Cassiopeia, because I am dying, and because I have carried a thing alone for 16 years that I have no more right to carry alone, and because I have finally understood that the thing I was most afraid of in all the world has turned out to be the only thing that can save us, and I owe this family an apology so large I do not know how to begin it. What changed in the Great Hall that January night was that the most powerful and the most secretive man in Britain came to the House of Black with 3 months to live and laid down his masks one at a time, and the family that had been raised to distrust him gathered around his chair to hear what was under them, because they had also been raised by a fierce old woman and a roguish lord, to know the difference between an enemy and a frightened ally, and to offer the second one a seat by the fire. He told them the prophecy first because he said it was theirs and he had stolen 16 years of it. "It was made to me before either of you was born," Dumbledore said, "by a seer who has never made another true word in her life, and I have kept it from you, Harry, and from your family on the theory that a child should not carry it. That was true. It was also convenient. Let me keep the only map of the war in my own pocket, and I have examined my heart these last black months, with the honesty the dying are finally permitted, and I find that I kept it as much for the keeping as for your protection, because a man who has managed the fate of nations for a century forgets how to simply give a thing away." He closed his eyes and recited, and the hall went still to hear it. "While the throne stands empty, the land lies open, and the open land breeds the dark. But the wards remember, sun and moon shall be born again to the old blood as the dark one rises, marked the one of them by his own hand at the very hour of his unmaking, and the dark one shall know them for his ending, and they shall know him for theirs. For he has torn himself to live forever, and they are bound to each other and to the land, and the torn thing cannot abide the held land, and the held land cannot abide the torn thing, and one must close the door upon the other. Neither can crown the crown while a piece of the Dark One wears a living face, and that face the Dark One made himself, the night the marking failed. So shall it end as it began, with a life freely given over a thing beloved, and the door shall shut, and the land shall be held, or the dark shall have it whole. The fire cracked, no one spoke. It was Hermione, of course, who said the thing aloud, because she did not wrap things, and because she had worked it out a year before Dumbledore ever opened his mouth, and had been carrying it alone to spare Harry, which Harry knew and would never forgive himself for not sparing her in turn. A piece of the Dark One wears a living face, she said. That face the Dark One made himself, the night the marking failed, the night he tried to kill a baby and the curse rebounded. The fragment had no vessel, and it went into the nearest living thing. Her voice did not break, which was worse than if it had. It's Harry. Harry is the last anchor. You can't crown the crown while a piece of Voldemort wears Harry's face. You've known for 16 years that to win this war Harry has to die. I have believed it for 16 years, Dumbledore said gently, and he opened his eyes and looked at Harry, and the kindness in them was real and went all the way down and could not, at the very bottom, look at itself. I planned a great deal of your life around it, Harry, before the Blacks ever took you, and I resented them for taking you because it took my plan out of my hands. I believed the child who survived was a vessel I had been given the terrible duty of raising to the slaughter, gently, kindly, so that when the hour came he would walk to his death with his eyes open, and the war would be won by his willing end. That is the one you declined a door from at 6 years old over a treacle tart. You were right to. I came here to tell you the truth at last, and the truth is that I would have spent you and called it love, and I am no longer certain it would have been a lie, which is the most frightening thing I have ever had to say. And Harry, 17, looked at the dying old man who had planned his death since before he could speak, and waited for the blow of it to land, and it did not land, because Arcturus had taught him on a deathbed that the difference between a king and a tyrant is which one believes the crown was given, and Harry could see plainly that Dumbledore had spent his whole life believing the crown of his own judgment had been given, and was only now, dying, learning that it had been lent by people who could starve. You should have told me, Harry said, not because I'd have agreed, because it was mine to carry and you took it, but I'm not going to die for you, sir. I'm going to tell you why, and then you're going to help us because you came here to, under all the apologizing. He looked at Hermione and at Cassiopeia, who had gone very still and very bright-eyed by the fire. Aunt Cass, you've been quiet. You worked it out too. Tell him the other way. The one you and Hermione have been whispering about in the tower for a year and not telling me, because apparently everyone in this family spares everyone else by carrying the worst thing alone, which we are going to stop doing, starting tonight, all of us. Cassiopeia Black rose from her chair, and what changed in the hall was that the prophecy stopped being a death sentence and became a problem, and the House of Black, which had spent 900 years refusing to accept that a thing handed down from on high could not be argued with, prepared to argue with destiny itself. There is another reading, Cassiopeia said. Albus has read the prophecy as a man who plans deaths reads everything, looking for the necessary sacrifice. I have read it as a keeper of the covenant, and it does not say Harry must die. Listen to the words, so shall it end as it began, with a life freely given over a thing beloved. That is not the language of slaughter, it is the language of the covenant. It is the exact phrase, Albus, the root phrase of the oldest binding we have, the same magic that turned the Dark Lord's curse the night Lily Potter laid her life down over her son. A life freely given over a thing beloved does not always mean a death. It means a self-offered. It is what Hermione does every time she wakes the silver. It is what Regulus did to the locket and lived. The covenant takes the offering, and where it can, it gives the offer back held, because the whole nature of the thing is that the land does not let go of those who bind themselves to it out of love. You are proposing, Dumbledore said slowly, and for the first time in the hall there was something in his face that was almost hope, that the coronation itself could burn the fragment out. That if Harry offers himself freely over a thing beloved, at the hour the crown binds and the land is held, the torn piece of soul, which cannot abide a held land, would be unmade as the locket was unmade, and the host, being alive and loved and sovereign and bound to the land by the very same act, would be carried through where an object could not. I am proposing, said Cassiopeia, that the only thing in all the world a Horcrux cannot survive is to be flooded with the thing it was made to escape, which is love freely given and a self made whole, and that we have spent 17 years building in this boy the most loved and least divided soul in Britain, for exactly this hour, whether we knew it or not. The locket died of 3 people's undivided love poured through a silver disc. Imagine what the full covenant could burn out, the 2 crowns bound, the whole land waking, the Queen's hand in the King's. It is not certain, I will not pretend it is certain. If the bond between them is not whole, if there is any false seam in it, any held-back piece, the offering will fail and the offer will not come back, and we will have spent the king of Albion to learn that we built him wrong." Her sea-gray eyes went to the two of them, the sun and the moon, 17 years old by the fire. "But I have watched these two since one of them was in a cradle and the other in a crawly cot, and I have staked my long life on them once already, the night the king came home, and I am old enough now to stake the little I have left. They are whole, there is no false seam. When the hour comes, the door will shut on the Dark Lord and not on Harry, because the thing we have made between these two is the most whole thing this broken family has produced in 900 years, and a torn soul cannot live in the light of it. That is my reading. I will wager everything on it. I have, in fact, already begun to." What changed by the fire was that a dying man laid down the last and heaviest of his masks, the certainty that he alone understood the necessary shape of sacrifice, and took up instead a thing he had not held in a century, which was faith in someone else's love. And Albus Dumbledore looked at the two 17-year-olds the House of Black had built against his every instinct and said very quietly, "Then I have spent 16 years preparing the wrong boy for the wrong death, and I have never in my life been so glad to have been wrong, and I will give you every hour I have left and every secret I own to make Cassiopeia's reading true." He died 6 weeks later in March in a chair by that same fire with the family around him, having given them the map of the last 2 Horcruxes and the location of 3 more sworn houses and 100 small cruel truths about the enemy, whole at the last, forgiven and forgiving, and Harry, who had declined his door at 6, wept at his passing because the old man had got there in the end, which was all any of them were trying to do. In his last lucid hour he had asked to be taken up to the roof, the Black's roof, the one place at Selim Hall he had never been allowed, and Harry had carried him up the cold stair himself and held him at the soft iron rail under the winter sky, and Dumbledore had looked at the crowded stars over the marches with the wonder of a man seeing them for the first and last time, and asked idly which one was Harry's. And Harry had pointed to the patient amber star in the east, still unnamed, and Dumbledore had looked at it a long while and said, "Ah, the one you have to know where to look for, of course. The showy ones were never going to be the ones who saved us," and had not spoken much after, and that was the last real thing the most powerful wizard of the age ever said on a roof about a star, having finally learned the lesson the family had built its whole life around. The cup and the diadem they took before the spring was out, and the taking of the cup put Harry in a room at last with the Black who had chosen the other way, and she was the dark mirror of everything his family was. Bellatrix Lestrange had been a Black before she was anything else, Sirius's cousin and Andromeda's sister and Cassiopeia's great-niece, and she had taken the family's old creed, Tauger's Pur, and read it the way the small minds always read it, as blood and cleanness and cruelty, and had given herself to the Dark Lord as utterly as Regulus had once tried to and never come back, because she had nothing whole in her to come back to. She kept the cup. The Dark Lord had given it to his most faithful to hide, and she hid it in the deepest vault of a Gringotts that had fallen to him along with everything else, and the family went in after it the hard way, with the goblins' grudging help and Tonks's aura craft and a great deal of fire. They got the cup. Hermione took it out of the burning vault with the tessera blazing in her free hand, and they got out, and Bellatrix caught them in the marble hall above, and for 10 seconds the two Blacks faced each other across the ruined gold, the niece who had chosen the dark and the young king her family had chosen the light to crown. "Little blood traitor's pet," Bellatrix crooned, and her eyes were the family's gray gone mad. "Playing king with a mudblood on your arm. My Aunt Cassiopeia must be so proud, the keeper of the line, crowning a half-blood and his dirty little queen. Tauger's Pur, cousin, always pure. You've made a filthy joke of 900 years. You don't know what it means," Harry said, and he did not raise his wand higher because Cassiopeia had taught him that the quietest voice in the room is the one to fear. "That's the whole tragedy of you, Bellatrix. You had it. You were born into the truest family in Britain, and they handed you the real creed and you couldn't hear it, because hearing it would have meant the cruelty was a choice and not a duty. Tauger's Pur doesn't mean clean. It means faithful. It means whole. It means you don't leave. You left. You left your own sister because she loved a kind man. You left every whole thing in yourself for a master who tore his own soul to bits, and you call that purity. You're not pure. You're the most divided thing in this room except the cup in my queen's hand, and you made yourself that way, the same as he did, out of fear." His voice did not rise, and it carried to every corner of the marble hall. "I'm not going to kill you. You'd like that. It'd prove the king as dirty as you. I'm going to beat you and leave you alive, and let you watch the land we hold close over you like water over a stone. And the worst thing I can do to you, Bella, the very worst, is let you live to see 2 whole people crowned over a held kingdom, and know you could have been us." And they beat her, the two of them, sun and moon moving as one creature with 2 bodies the way Cassiopeia had drilled into them for 9 years. Harry's nerve drawing her wildest curses and Hermione's sight 3 moves ahead of her madness. and they left Bellatrix Lestrange screaming in the wreck of a fallen bank with the cup gone and her master's soul a fragment lighter. And what changed in the marble hall was that Harry stood at last in front of the proof of what his family might have been. The Black who read the creed as cruelty and refused it utterly, and the refusing was the most kingly thing he had ever done, and Andromeda, when they told her they had spared her sister, held Harry's face in both her hands and could not speak. The diadem they took from Hogwarts itself in the dead of the same spring, out of the room in the castle that hides what must not be found, and they nearly burned for it, and Harry pulled an enemy out of the fire on his way to the door, and that was the night Hermione first called him, out loud, my king, and meant it as a fact and not a hope. Hogwarts was contested ground by then, the school half emptied, the staff divided, a garrison of the Dark Lord's people squatting in the lower castle and the old defenders holding the towers, and the children went in by the ways Harry had learned at 11, the moving stairs and the corridors that changed on which days, because a castle remembers the students who loved it. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw lay where the Dark Lord had hidden it as a boy, in the vast junk cathedral of the Room of Requirement, among the lost and forbidden things of 1,000 years, and they found it on its bust of stone, the anchor of his stolen wisdom, cold and crowned and wrong. Hermione had a basilisk fang in her bag, one of 3 she had drawn from the dead serpent in the chamber at 12 and kept for 5 years against exactly this, because she was a girl who kept things that might be needed, and she put the fang through the diadem in the dust of the room, and it screamed and bled black and died, the 4th of the Dark Lord's anchors gone in their hands. And then the fire came. A Death Eater had followed them in, one of Mulciber's young fanatics, and seeing the diadem destroyed and the heirs cornered, he panicked and cast a curse he could not control, fiendfire, the cursed flame that takes the shape of beasts and eats stone, and the whole mountain of lost things went up at once, a tide of living fire pouring through the cathedral of the room toward the only door. They ran, they could have reached the door. And at the last turn Harry saw the one who had cast it, the young fanatic himself, gone down under a falling pillar with the fire coming on, screaming an enemy, a servant of the thing that had killed Harry's parents and Ted and 100 others, and Harry turned back into the fiendfire and dragged him out by the collar, because a king who lets a man burn to save himself a risk is not a king worth crowning. And the 3 of them came through the door an inch ahead of the fire and went down in a heap in the 7th floor corridor, scorched and alive, the diadem dead in Hermione's bag and a sobbing Death Eater alive in Harry's grip, who would, within the month, lay down his master's mark and swear to the crown, because the King of Albion had walked into fiendfire to pull him out of it. You absolute lunatic, Hermione said, beating the embers out of his hair with both hands, half scolding and half something the ward did not usually leave room for. You went back into fiendfire for one of theirs. And then she stopped with her hands in his scorched hair and the dead diadem at her hip, and she looked at him at what he had just been, and she said it, the thing she had been not saying as long as he had, the plain fact of it. My king, God help me, you really are. You went back for him because that's what the crown is, that's the whole of what it is, and I have read 900 years of it and never understood it until you set yourself on fire for an enemy in a burning room. She pulled him to his feet. 4 down, 2 left, and one of them's you. Come on, we've got a kingdom to save and you smell like a bonfire. What changed in the burning castle was that the last of Harry's anchors but one fell to a fang in the dust, and the King of Albion proved in fire what he had only ever claimed in words, that fealty runs both ways and a sovereign serves before he is served, and an enemy was turned not by force but by mercy, which Hermione understood, watching, to be the single most dangerous weapon the Dark Lord had no answer for at all. They were both 17 and of age, and the night before they went to find the old seat Harry finally said the thing he had been not saying for years, and he said it badly, which Hermione later told him was the only reason she believed it. It was the roof, because it was always the roof. The patient amber star hung in the east, still unnamed, and Spica burned overhead, the double that looked like one, and the moor lay silver under them the way it had when they were children naming the sky, except that they were not children, and tomorrow they would walk into the deepest lays in Britain to wake a crown, and one of them might not walk out because the fragment behind Harry's eyes made every fight a thing that could end him. I've worked out what to hang the name on, Harry said. My star. You said I'd know when I had something to hang it on. Hermione went still beside him. Harry, I'm not doing it tonight. I want to do it at the coronation if we both live to have one, because I want it to be the truest thing I've ever said and I want the whole sky to hear it. He turned to her on the cold lid. But I worked out years ago what I'm going to call it, and I worked out why I've been waiting, and the why is the part that matters, so I'm going to say the why now, tonight, in case tomorrow goes wrong, because we don't wrap things and we don't carry the worst thing alone. You taught me both, and I've been breaking both for about 3 years where you're concerned. He took her hand as he had since they were 7, except that it was not as he had since they were 7, and they both knew it and had both known it for longer than either had said. I love you, not crown love, not the covenant, not sun and moon, not the thing the old magic needs us to be. You, the girl who asked me for it in writing that she didn't have to marry me. I'd have followed you off this roof at 8 years old, and I'd follow you off it now, and the only reason I haven't said it is that everything else between us is so enormous, the throne and the war and the whole watching country, that I wanted there to be one thing that was just ours, that nobody crowned us into, that we chose. Given or chosen, Aunt Cass says. Everything else was given. This I choose you, that's the why, that's what I'm going to hang the name on. Hermione Granger looked at him for a long moment under her chosen star, the cleverest and once the loneliest girl in Britain, who had woken a crown at 8 and a kingdom's law at 14 and had carried a prophecy alone for a year to spare him, and she did the thing she did when a thing was finally settled, which was let everything else go all at once. You absolute fool, she said, and her voice was not steady at all. I chose you on a roof when I was 8 years old and picked a double star on purpose and made you say it out loud that two that look like one is the cleverest thing a star can do. I have been choosing you every single day since, in writing and out of it, and waiting for you to catch up, which is, frankly, the slowest you have ever been at anything. And she kissed him on the cold roof under the given star and the chosen one, 17 and of age and entirely their own, and the moor lay silver below and the whole sky wheeled over them. And for 1 hour the war and the throne and the fragment and the morning could not get in, because that was what the roof had always been for. They stayed up there a long time after, not doing very much, which was its own kind of astonishment after 17 years of doing a great deal. They lay back on the cold lead with their shoulders touching and traced the old constellations Hermione had taught him, and the family names Cassiopeia had taught them both, and they did not talk about the morning, the hill, the fragment, the cost, because Sirius had taught them as a discipline to set the weight down, and there had never in their whole lives been an hour that needed it set down more. At some point Hermione made him promise, in the small clear voice she used only on the roof, that whatever the covenant did to him tomorrow, whatever the offering cost, he would come back, because she had not waited 9 years for him to catch up only to be left in the gallery alone. And Harry promised because he did not wrap things, and because he had every intention of keeping it, and because the promise itself, a self freely given over a thing beloved, was already the magic, was already pulling taut between them like a thread of the deep wards, though neither of them named it. The patient star burned in the east. Spica burned overhead, the double that looked like one. And the King and Queen of Albion held hands on a freezing roof on the last quiet night either of them would ever have, and wanted, for that 1 hour, nothing in the world they did not already have, which was the thing the family had fought 900 years to make possible, and had in these two, against all the dark, finally made. What changed under the stars was the one thing in all of it that nothing, not the Dark Lord and not the prophecy and not the cost still to come, would ever be able to take from them. That before they were ever a king and a queen, they were a yes freely given over a thing beloved, which was, though neither said it that night, the very shape of the magic that was going to save them. The old seat opened to them at the dark of the moon, where the deepest lays crossed under a hollow hill in the marches, and the crown of Albion was waiting where it had waited 900 years, and Cassiopeia Black gave her life to put it in their hands. The way in answered to both bloods together, as the histories had said, the sun's hand and the moon's pressed to the bare stone of the hill, and the hill opened and they went down, the two heirs and the family behind them, into a vast dark hall under the earth where the lays ran like rivers of cold light and a single throne stood, 2 thrones rather, twined as the crown was twined, gold and silver, and on a stone between them lay the crown of Albion itself, the great relic. Gold and silver woven into one circle that the eye could not quite hold, asleep, waiting. The hall under the hill was older than language, a cathedral of the deep magic with no roof but the living rock and no light but the lays themselves, those rivers of cold fire that ran the length of Britain and met here, under the marches, in a slow wheeling knot of gold and silver radiance that turned overhead like a galaxy brought down into the earth. The air tasted of stone and starlight. The 2 thrones stood at the heart of the knot, twined and patient, and every surface of the vast place was carved with the long history of the sovereignty, 900 years of kings and queens and the bright span before the sundering, and the carvings seemed to lean toward the 2 living heirs as they entered, the way the portraits at Selim Hall had leaned toward a baby, the whole weight of the buried past turning at last to look at its returning future. And the Dark Lord's people were already there, because the Dark Lord had felt the lays stir when the hill opened and had thrown his nearest servants at the seat to stop what was coming, and the dark under the hill filled with fire. It was Cassiopeia who held the stair. She was 90 years old and she had been a duelist before any of them were born, and when the Death Eaters poured down the only stair into the hall, she put herself across it with her wand up and her silver hair like a crown, and she held it, alone, so that the heirs could reach the crown. She held it the way the House of Black had held its faith for 900 years, against impossible odds and at impossible cost, and she was magnificent, and she was not going to survive it, and she knew it when she took her place on the stair, and she did it anyway because she had spent 90 years keeping an oath and she meant to die with it kept. She fought as she had taught 2 children to fight in a long gallery, economical and merciless and entirely without fear, 90 years old and worth 10 of the marked men who came at her down the narrow stair. And for a while she simply would not let them pass, an old woman with silver hair and a wand that had been killing better wizards than these since before their grandfathers were born, and the bodies piled on the stair below her, and still she held, naming each spell in the old tongue as she cast it. The same as she had once named the portraits to a child, a lesson and a defiance at once. They could only reach her in the end with numbers, with a dozen wands where there should have been one, and even then it cost them, and she went down still casting, still teaching, the last keeper of an oath 900 years old, holding a stair so that the future could climb past her to its crown. Harry tried to go to her, she would not have it. The crown, she said over her shoulder, not turning, her wand never stopping. That is the whole of it, child, that is everything I have lived for. You do not come to the old woman on the stair. You go to the crown and you wake it, and you let me see it woken before I go, because I have waited my whole life, and I will not be cheated of the only thing I ever wanted by your sentiment. Go. And Harry, who had been taught by this fierce old woman in a long gallery what the words on the walls meant, obeyed her, because obeying her was the last gift he could give her, and he and Hermione crossed the hall of the Lays to the stone between the thrones and laid their hands on the crown of Albion together, the sun and the moon, and it woke. It woke the way the silver had woken over Hermione's head when she was 8, except that it was not one crown but the whole, the gold and the silver, the king's circlet and the queen's, and it came apart gently in their hands into 2, and the light of it filled the hall under the hill and rose up the stair, and Cassiopeia Black, holding the stair against the dark with the last of her strength, felt the light of the woken crown of Albion come up behind her and wash over her, gold and silver. 900 years of waiting answered at her back, and she laughed, the dry, fierce laugh that had terrorized 3 generations, and she said, to the dark she was holding and to the light behind her and to the whole watching dead of her house, there, at last, I told you. I told you he would come home, and she fell on the stair with the crown woken and the faith kept and a smile on her hard old face, the last keeper of the oath, who had found a king in a cradle and a queen in a parish register, and lived exactly long enough to see them take up the thing she had given her whole life to keeping. They could not stop, though every part of Harry wanted to stop. The Death Eaters broke and fled before the woken crown, because the light of a held land is the one thing the Dark Lord's people cannot abide, and the family gathered up Cassiopeia's body with a tenderness that did not have time to be grief, and they climbed out of the hill into the grey dawn with 2 crowns and one terrible loss, and on the moor above, against the rising light, the sky was wrong from horizon to horizon, black and boiling. Because the Dark Lord had felt the crown wake from 100 miles away and understood that the door he had kept open for 50 years was about to be shut forever, and was coming, with everything he had left, with all his torn and gathered dark, to stop the coronation or die trying. He's coming to the seat, Regulus said, looking at the black sky with his aunt's body in his arms and his aunt's fierce calm in his voice, steadier than Harry had ever heard him. He knows it's tonight. He knows if they crown the land closes against him forever, and the fragment in Harry's scar dies with the rest. He's going to throw the whole war at this hill before the moon sets. He looked at the 2 of them, the king and queen of Albion, 17 years old, crowned in their hands and not yet on their heads, with the woman who had raised them dead between them. Then we don't run, Towger's purr. We hold the hill and we crown you here tonight over the deepest lays in Britain, the way it was always meant to be done, and we shut the door, all of us together, the way Cassiopeia taught us. And the family closed around the 2 heirs on the dawn moor, the whole of the House of Black and the sworn houses gathering to the woken crown like iron to a star. And what changed on the hill above the old seat was that the long waiting ended and the last night began, and the king and queen of Albion turned to face the coming dark with 2 crowns in their hands and a kingdom at their backs, and the whole cost of 900 years gathered behind their eyes, and did not, either of them, let go of the other's hand. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. King and Queen of Albion. The Dark Lord came to the hill at moonset with the whole of his gathered dark, and the House of Black met him on the moor above the old seat, and the last battle of the empty throne began under a sky boiling black from edge to edge. They had the night and they had the hill and they had the woken crown, and against that the Dark Lord had numbers and terror and 50 years of the rotted land at his back, and the 2 forces came together on the high moor with a sound like the sea breaking on stone. The sworn houses held the slopes, 11 banners and the families behind them, the greengrass gray and the others, wands up in the dark, the first army the crown of Albion had fielded in 900 years. And the Dark Lord's people poured up the hill against them, the marked and the maddened and the bought, with Bellatrix Lestrange screaming at their head and Mulciber's fanatics behind her, and the giants Voldemort had woken out of the northern hills coming on like falling towers. Harry had read of war and he had lost people to it, Ted and Cassiopeia and 100 others, but he had never stood inside it, and the inside of it was fire and screaming and the green light flashing in the dark and the ground gone to churned mud and bodies, and there was no glory in it anywhere, only the family fighting to hold a hill long enough to crown 2 children over a buried throne. The giants came first, 3 of them, woken out of the northern hills and driven south by the Dark Lord's will, and they came up the slope like walking towers, and the sworn houses met them the way Cassiopeia had taught the whole kingdom to fight in the months of the siege, not as 11 proud families each defending its own honor, but as one line, one woven shield, the wards of their warded seats reaching out through their wands to make a wall of the living and the dead together. The first giant went down to 100 curses braided into one rope of fire by 11 houses casting as a single hand, and the slope shook when it fell and the line held. Orla Greengrass, who had been the first to kneel in the ruin of her own hall to a 14-year-old who promised her justice, stood at the center of that line with the loss of a husband still raw in her after 17 years, and gave all of it to the holding of the hill, and where she stood the line did not bend. They were not soldiers. They were old, proud, frightened families who had made, every one of them, the arithmetic any parent makes and chosen the held land over the open one, and they died on that slope in numbers the histories would mourn for a century, and they bought with every yard of ground another minute for the 2 children climbing toward the buried throne, and they knew it, and they paid it because that was what an oath had turned out to mean in the end when the dark finally came. Not glory, not privilege, but a place in the line where you did not bend. Sirius led the Moor. He was magnificent and he was reckless, and he was, that night, exactly the lord the House of Black had needed for 17 years, and he held the high ground with Tonks at his left and the sworn houses at his back, and where the line bent he was there, the dog star, brightest in the sky and impossible to ignore, drawing the worst of the dark onto himself so the children could reach the hill. Andromeda fought beside her sister's enemies as a healer fights, dragging the fallen out of the fire, mending what could be mended, and twice she came wand to wand with Bellatrix in the churning dark, the 2 black sisters who had chosen opposite ends of the same creed, and twice neither could finish it, because some old thing between sisters is stronger than a war, and they broke apart each time into the chaos. And Regulus, who had spent his youth in the Dark Lord's service and the rest of his life in penance for it, fought his way to the thing he had been hunting since the cave, the great serpent Nagini, the Dark Lord's last anchor but one, coiled and vast at the center of the dark guarding its master's mortality, and Sirius Black met the snake alone in the mud with a sword of goblin silver the family had carried out of Selim Hall, and he was bitten badly and he struck anyway. Because he was whole now and a whole man can give his life over a thing beloved, and he took the serpent's head off in a spray of black blood and went down in the mud with the last of his master's anchors, but Harry dead at his hand, and a smile on his face that had no penance left in it at all. Harry and Hermione fought up the hill together, and 7 years of Cassiopeia's drilling stood revealed at last for what it had always been, which was preparation for this exact night. They moved as one creature with 2 bodies the way the old witch had hammered into them in the long gallery, a left hand and a right, Harry's nerve drawing the curses and Hermione's sight 3 moves ahead of every wand that turned toward them, and where one of them would have died 10 times over, the 2 of them cut a clean bright line through the churning dark toward the hilltop. They did not speak. They had stopped needing to speak years before. Hermione saw the Giants' Club come down, and Harry was already not there. Harry felt the curse coming at his blind side, and Hermione's shield was already up, and the Dark Lord's people, who had expected 2 frightened children, met instead the single most dangerous thing on the moor, a sovereign pair fighting as the Covenant had always meant a pair to fight, and broke around them like water around a stone. Peter Pettigrew tried to stop them near the top. He came scrambling out of the dark, the traitor who had sold Harry's parents and bought the Dark Lord's body with Ted Tonks's blood in a quiet lane, and he had a silver hand the Dark Lord had given him and a wand and 13 years of cowardice, and he got between the heirs and the hill because cowards are always exactly where the danger is least. He did not get a curse out. Harry looked at the one who had murdered his mother and father by pointing a finger, the rot at the root of his whole orphaned life, and felt the thing that wanted to kill rise in him, and set it down, because Cassiopeia had taught him that the quietest voice is the one to fear, and Arcturus had taught him that a king is not a tyrant, and he did not kill Peter Pettigrew. He disarmed him and bound him and left him alive for the justice of a held kingdom, which was a far worse fate for a man like Peter than any curse, and went on up the hill. Pettigrew, who had once been spared by Sirius's mercy toward a crying baby and had repaid it with 13 years of murder, was undone in the end by the same mercy in the baby grown to a king, and there was a justice in that older than any law. What changed on the moor in the first hour of the last battle was that the House of Black spent itself without flinching to buy 2 children a path to a buried throne, and Harry, fighting toward the hill with Hermione at his side and the woken crown a weight of gold and silver in his pack, understood that everything the family had ever taught him, the dueling and the law and the porridge and the stars, had been bending the whole time toward this one night. When the faith kept for 900 years would be either crowned or extinguished, and that there was no version of it where the cost was not terrible, and no version where he was permitted to set the weight down, and he stopped looking for one and went up the hill. They opened the seat with both bloods at the height of the battle, and went down into the hall of the lays to crown the crown while the moor burned over their heads, and the deep magic rose to meet them like a tide that had been drawing back for 900 years. The hill opened to the sun's hand and the moon's as it had 3 nights before, and the family closed the way behind them. What was left of the family, Sirius bleeding from a dozen wounds and Andromeda gray, with effort and Tonks holding the stair where Cassiopeia had held it and died. Harry and Hermione went down alone into the great hall under the earth, into the cathedral of living rock where the lays ran in rivers of cold gold and silver fire, and met in their slow turning knot over the 2 twined thrones. And they carried the crown of Albion to the stone between the thrones, and they began the rite that Cassiopeia had taught them in a tower over 17 winters. The oldest rite there was, the binding of a sovereign pair to the land out of love. There were no robes and no witnesses and no music. There was only the deep magic and the 2 of them, scorched and bloodied and 17, and the words. Hermione spoke the queen's part, the moon's in the old tongue Regulus had given them, her voice steady and clear under the turning lays, binding herself to the land and the people, a self freely given, and the silver half of the crown of Albion woke in her hands and rose and settled, the width of a breath above her thundercloud hair, fitted to a brow it had waited 9 centuries to find. And Harry spoke the king's part, the sun's, and bound himself, and the gold half woke in his hands, and the 2 halves of the crown reached for each other across the space between the heirs, the way the heirs had reached for each other across a table when they were 8 years old, and the whole hall of the lays blazed up gold and silver as the covenant of Albion, broken at the sundering, began, thread by thread, to bind again. It was the most beautiful thing Harry had ever stood inside, and the most terrible, because he could feel the whole weight of it, 900 years of it, the buried throne and the rotted wards and every dark lord who had risen out of the wound, all of it gathering now to this one point under the hill, where 2 17-year-olds were trying to close a wound the size of a country with nothing but the oldest words and their own undivided hearts. The lays turned overhead in their slow knot of gold and silver, faster now, brighter, drawing in toward the 2 thrones. The carvings on the walls, 9 centuries of sovereigns, seemed to lift their stone faces. And the crown of Albion, the great twined relic that had slept on its stone since the sundering, blazed between them like a second sun and a second moon brought down into the earth, the gold reaching for Harry and the silver for Hermione, 2 halves of one circle that had been waiting 900 years to find 2 brows that loved each other enough to wear it without breaking. Cassiopeia had said the throne cost you ever being only yourself again, and Harry, with the gold crown a breath from his head and the deep magic singing in his blood, paid the price gladly, because the thing he was binding himself to was not power, it was the land and the people and the girl across the stone, and a self given to those was not a self lost, and the land woke. They felt it go out from the hill in every direction, the wards of Britain remembering their sovereigns, the lay rivers running bright from the marches to the sea, 900 years of rot burning off in a wave of cold clean fire, the held land waking from end to end, every hollow hill and standing stone and warded house ringing at once like a struck bell, and far away the Dark Lord's people on the moor felt the ground itself turn against them. Felt the country they had bled for 50 years close like water over a stone and faltered, and the sworn houses on the slopes felt the wards come up at their backs and roared and drove them down the hill. It was working, it was almost done. The covenant was binding and the land was holding, and the 2 crowns were a breath from their brows. And then the Dark Lord came down the stair into the hall of the lays, because he had felt the land close against him and understood that he had moments, not hours, before the door shut on him forever, and he had torn through the family at the stair and through Tonks who would carry the scars of it the rest of her life. And he came down into the deep magic alone, the most divided soul that had ever lived. White and snake-faced and burning with the whole of his gathered dark, to do the one thing that could still stop the right, which was to kill the king of Albion before the crown could settle on his head. He could not abide the hall. That was the first thing, and it would have been the saving thing, except that he had come for one purpose, and a creature with one purpose is hard to stop. The light of the held land, the gold and silver of the binding covenant, was the exact opposite of everything the Dark Lord had made of himself, and it burned him, his torn soul recoiling from the radiance of a land made whole, and he came on anyway through his own agony, his wand up, his red eyes fixed on Harry, because if the king died the right died and the door stayed open, and he could endure anything, even this, for that. And Harry, with the gold crown a breath above his head and the last fragment of the Dark Lord's own soul buried behind his scar, understood all at once and entirely what the prophecy had meant, and what Cassiopeia had wagered her life on, and what he had to do. He let the crown go. He set the gold half of the crown of Albion down on the stone, unfinished, uncrowned, and he stepped away from the rite and out into the open hall between the thrones, between the Dark Lord and Hermione, unarmed, his wand lowered, and he did the thing the oldest magic in the world had been waiting 900 years for a king brave enough to do. "You want me," Harry said into the burning dark. "Here I am, no crown, no wand, no fight. You made a piece of yourself the night you killed my mother, and it's been living behind my eyes my whole life, and the only way to kill it is for me to give it up freely over a thing I love, which is the one move you have never once in your whole torn existence been able to make, and which I have been raised by the best family in Britain my entire life to make without even thinking about it." He spread his empty hands. "So here it is, a life freely given. Take it and kill your own last anchor doing it, because you can't help yourself, you never could. You've been killing the pieces of your own soul since before I was born, and you're going to do it one more time. This is the door, Tom. I'm the door. Shut it." Behind him at the right, Hermione understood what he was doing in the half-second before he did it, because she had always seen 3 moves ahead of everyone, and for that half-second, the whole brilliant, stubborn force of her wanted to scream his name and break the rite and drag him back from the open floor by his collar. She did not. It was the hardest thing she had ever done in a life that had not been short of hard things, harder than waking the silver at 8 or building the writ at 14 or carrying the prophecy alone for a year, and she did it because she had read the prophecy 40 ways and knew Cassiopeia's reading was the true one, and because she trusted the plan, and because under the plan she trusted him. Trusted that a self freely given over a thing beloved comes back, because the land does not let go of what loves it. So she did not scream and she did not break the rite. She held the silver crown a breath above her brow, and she kept the queen's part going, steady and clear, binding the land even as the one she loved walked out unarmed to offer himself to its enemy, and she poured every ounce of the love that was going to bring him back into the one thing she could still do for him, which was finish the covenant so that there would be a held land to catch him when he fell. That was the division of it, the left hand and the right, even here, even now. He gave himself, and she held the door open for his return, and neither could have done it without the other, which was the whole of what the old magic had ever meant by a pair. And the Dark Lord, who could no more decline a defenseless enemy than he could love, who had been offered a free killing and could not in his whole divided nature refuse it, screamed into the Hall of the Lays and struck Harry Potter with the killing curse, and the green light took him, and the last fragment of Lord Voldemort's soul, anchored in the living face the curse itself had made 17 years before, was caught in the blast of its own master's magic and burned, in the radiance of a land made whole to nothing. Harry fell. For a moment or a year he was somewhere very bright and very quiet, a between place with no walls, and it was not frightening, because he had spent his whole life learning not to flinch from the dark or the light, and there was someone there. A young woman with his own eyes and hair the color of autumn, who had laid her life down over him in a ruined nursery when he was 15 months old, the first life freely given of all of them, the root of everything. She did not say very much. She told him she was proud of him, which he had waited his whole life to hear, and had not known it. She told him the family he had been given was a good one, the best that she had watched, that she and James had watched the whole time. She told him that she had not been able to give him a childhood, that her own life freely given had bought him only an hour, and that the Blacks had given him the rest, the 17 years of porridge and stars and burned Sunday roasts, and that she would love them past the end of the world for it, the fierce, complicated house that had taken her son when she could not keep him and raised him whole. She told him Cassiopeia had arrived where the dead arrive a few nights before, fierce and dry and entirely unsurprised to find the afterlife in want of management. She told him Regulus had just come, smiling, undivided, the cave finally behind him. She told him the dead were not the ones he should grieve hardest for, because the dead were held now too in the held land, in the covenant, in the long memory of a sovereignty made whole. That it was the living who needed him, and one of the living in particular, who was at that moment on her knees on a stone floor refusing, with the whole stubborn brilliance that had woken a crown at 8 to let him go. And she told him it was not finished, that a door half shut is a door, that he had a queen at a throne and a crown on a stone in a country waking at his back, and that the whole point of a life freely given over a thing beloved, the thing the Dark Lord had never understood, was that the land does not let go of those who give themselves to it out of love. Go back, Lily Potter told her son in the bright, quiet place. Go and be whole. We never left you. We were your first star. And then she was the light, and the light was the Lays, and Harry Potter opened his eyes on the stone floor of the hall under the hill with the gold crown beside his hand, and the covenant blazing, and a queen on her knees over him with her silver crown burning above her brow and her hands fisted in his collar. You promised, Hermione was saying, fierce and low and not steady at all. You promised me on the roof you'd come back, Harry, Harry, we don't leave, get up. Get up and put the crown on, you absolute fool, the land's waiting, I'm waiting, get up. And Harry got up. He took up the gold half of the crown of Albion from the stone, and Hermione's hands were over his, the way they had been over a silver disc when she was 8 and over a locket when she was 14, warm over his. And together, the sun and the moon, they set the king's crown on his head and the queen's on hers in the same moment, and the covenant of Albion bound at last, whole, 2 thrones and 2 crowns and 2 souls given freely to the land and to each other. And the hall of the Lays went to pure light, and 900 years of waiting ended in a single ringing chord that was felt in every warded stone in Britain. The Dark Lord had a moment to understand it. He stood in the hall of the Lays, his last anchor burned, his immortality spent, mortal at last after 50 years, in the one place in all the world where the land was most awake and most held, before the 2 crowned sovereigns to whom that land had just bound itself heart and root, and he raised his wand one final time, because striking was the only thing his torn nature had left, and he cast the killing curse at the crowned king of Albion. And the land would not have it. The curse left his wand and crossed the hall and broke against Harry Potter like a wave against a cliff, because Harry was bound now to every hollow hill and lay river and warded stone in Britain, and the whole woken country rose in that instant to shield its sovereign the way a mother shields a child, the way Lily Potter had shielded him once and shown them all how. A life freely given multiplied now 900-fold, a whole land's love standing between its king and the dark. Every warded stone in Britain rang at once, every hollow hill lined toward the marches. The Lays ran bright from end to end of the country, and the whole of the woken land poured its strength up through the floor of the hall and into the crowned man at its heart. And the killing curse, the curse that had no counter, the curse that had murdered Harry's mother and father and Ted Tonks and 100 others, found for the first time in its long history a target it could not touch, because you cannot kill a man a whole country has bound itself to keep alive. And the curse, finding no purchase on a man the entire country had decided to keep, turned, the way the old magic loves a circle, and went back across the hall to the only torn and loveless and unguarded thing in it. And Lord Voldemort was struck down by his own curse in a land that held its king and fell and did not rise and was, after 50 years and 7 torn pieces and an ocean of murdered love, simply and finally dead. And on the moor above, in the same instant, the binding of the covenant ran out across the land like dawn across water, and the host of the Dark Lord came apart. The bought and the frightened threw down their wands and fell to their knees on ground that was suddenly, terribly sovereign. And the worst of the marked, the ones who had torn themselves smallest in his service, who had made of their own creed the cruelty that the true creed had never meant, could no more abide the held land than their master had, and were unmade on the slopes, screaming his name into a country that no longer had any room in it for them. Bellatrix Lestrange died there on the hill, on the warded ground of the family she had betrayed, a black who had read Towger's Purr's blood and cruelty and given herself to a torn master until there was nothing whole left in her to save, and the land she had bled took her back into itself and would not keep her. And Andromeda, who could never have struck the killing blow against her own sister, stood on the slope in the dawn and watched the sister she had lost long before tonight finally go. And what she felt was too old and too complicated for any word in any tongue. The hall was very quiet after. The Lays turned gold and silver overhead, slow and bright and at peace. And the king and queen of Albion stood crowned in the light of a land made whole, holding hands over the body of the dark thing that had kept the throne empty for 900 years, 17 years old, scorched and bloodied and alive, and the door that Ted Tonks had died beside, and Cassiopeia and Regulus and Dumbledore and Harry's own mother and father was shut forever, and the long open season of Dark Lords was over. And what changed in the Hall of the Lays was everything the family had given everything for. The house was not empty anymore. Somebody had come home. They climbed out of the hill into a gray dawn that had stopped boiling, into a moor gone quiet, into the arms of what the family had left, and the cost was counted in the cold light, and it was terrible, and it was borne, because the family had spent 17 years teaching its children exactly how to bear it. Regulus was gone in the mud with the serpent's head beside him, and the penance finally paid. They found him with the smile still on his face, and Sirius knelt in the churned ground over his little brother, the brother he had buried once in his own mind and got back and lost again for real, and Harry knelt with him, and they were wet-faced together the way they had been over Arcturus 11 years before, the lord of the House of Black and his king, and Sirius said brokenly, he was whole at the end. You gave him that, he died whole after everything, and that's the most this family ever knew how to ask for, and Harry held his godfather in the dawn and did not wrap it and did not let go. Cassiopeia they had already lost on the stair, Ted they had lost in a lane on a Tuesday, Dumbledore in a chair by a fire looking at a star. And others, Swornhouse dead on the slopes, Aurors who had refused the dark, names that would go on to the moor beside Arcturus until the family graveyard was a history of the war. Andromeda had survived, and Tonks, scarred and limping and alive, her hair gone that morning, a fierce defiant pink for the first time since her father died. They buried the dead over the following days under a sky that held its stars again, and Harry looked up at it now without flinching, because Hermione had taught him on a roof that you could carry the worst thing and still find your star, and because the stars, for the first time in 900 years, were the stars of a held and sovereign land. Cassiopeia they buried at the head of the family plot, above Arcturus and Ted and now Regulus, under a stone that bore no dates and only 4 words, the family creed read true at last, Toujourspur, always faithful. Harry stood over it a long time the morning of the burial, the king she had found in a cradle and raised in a long gallery and never once softened the truth for, and he thought of the genealogy in the West Tower with its 2 long branches running down to 2 names, the sun and the moon, that she had filled in over 90 years of keeping faith in a thing the world called a children's tale. And he went up to the tower after alone and took the great book down, and below his own name and Hermione's, at the very bottom of the 900-year branch, in a hand that did not shake though it had every right to, he wrote the only words that belonged there, the words a fierce old woman had written under an empty branch the night a king first came home, and had lived exactly long enough to see answered. "The faith is kept," Harry wrote. And he underlined it twice and closed the book, and went down to his queen and his family and his held and quiet kingdom, and that was the last entry the House of Black ever needed to make. And then there was the coronation that the world saw, a fortnight later, not the rite under the hill that had bound the covenant in blood and lays, but the one the kingdom needed on the moor above Selim Hall, with the 11 sworn houses and the 100 that had hurried to swear once the land woke, and all the people of magical Britain who could come, a country crawling up out of 50 years of fear into a strange new morning with a king and a queen in it. Harry and Hermione stood on the moor under the open sky in the gold and silver crowns, and Sirius, Lord Black, who had lifted a screaming baby out of a ruined cot and chosen him over revenge and raised him into this, spoke the old words that named them sovereign, and the House of Black and the whole watching kingdom made the answer the portraits had made over a sleeping infant 17 years before, a sound like wind down a long gallery, like the sea heard far inland. "We keep the king, we keep the queen, we keep the faith, Toujourspur, always faithful." The throne of Albion was filled. It did not look, that day on the moor, the way the old paintings of coronations looked, all gold and distance and a sovereign lifted up above the people. It looked like a family. The 2 of them stood in the crowns that had bound the covenant under the hill, in plain dark clothes, because the kingdom had nothing grander to give them yet, and they had wanted nothing grander. And around them stood not courtiers, but the House of Black, Sirius weeping and pretending it was the wind, Andromeda with her arm around Tonks, the empty space among them where Cassiopeia and Regulus and Ted should have stood kept open and honored, the way the 4th stool was kept. And beyond the family stood the sworn houses, fewer than there had been a fortnight before, and beyond them the people, the ordinary witches and wizards of a country crawling up out of 50 years of fear, who had come to the moor not because they were commanded, but because they wanted, after everything, to see with their own eyes that the long dark had a morning on the other side of it. And the morning had 2 faces in it, 17 years old, an orphan from a ruined cot and a girl hidden in a crawly cradle, who had been given to each other and to this kingdom, and who would, the people understood, looking at the way the 2 of them stood with their hands joined and their shoulders touching, never once leave it or each other in the dark. When it was done, when the kingdom had roared itself hoarse and the long day bent toward dusk, Harry did the one thing he had been saving, the thing he had told Hermione on a roof he would do at the coronation if they both lived to have one, because he wanted the whole sky to hear it. He waited until the first stars came out over the moor. Then he found the patient amber star low in the east, the one Sirius had given him in a cottage by the sea when he was 15 months old, the one that had no name because Harry had been waiting his whole life to have something to hang the name on, and he took Hermione's hand, and he lifted their joined hands to the sky in front of the whole kingdom, and he named his star at last. "Every Black gets a star," he said, and his voice carried across the moor in the dusk, "and you name it for the promise you make about who you're going to be. Mine's waited 17 years for its name because I didn't have the promise yet. I have it now." He found Regulus's word, the first word the old tongue ever gave him, in a study with the door held open a hand's width, the word that meant whole and unbroken and undivided against itself, the word that named the exact opposite of everything the Dark Lord had made of his own soul, and the exact thing the Covenant had made of Harry's. "I name it Siphon, whole. Because that's what she made me, and that's what the family made me, and that's what a king is supposed to be, undivided, faithful, the opposite of the thing we put in the ground under the hill. The patient star in the east is Siphon now, the whole one, and it sits a little way from the maiden's brightest, from Spica, the double that looks like one, which is hers, which she chose herself when she was 8 years old, because 2 that look like one is the cleverest thing a star can do. And now anyone in Britain who is ever lost on any dark night forever can look up and find the king's star and the queen's, the whole one and the double one, sitting near each other in the eastern sky and know exactly where the throne is and exactly where they belong because that's the whole trick, that's the only thing I've ever really known. Find your star and you're never lost, 2 stars and you're never alone. Hermione was not steady and did not pretend to be, and the kingdom was roaring, and Sirius had his face in his hands, and somewhere Andromeda was holding Tonks, and the stars came out one by one over a land that held them, the whole one and the double one rising together in the east. And Harry Potter, who had been an orphan in a ruined cot and a ward of a complicated, fierce-loving house, and the heir of a buried throne and the door through which a dark lord finally fell, stood crowned on a moor beside the girl he had met on a roof, his equal in all things, his queen, his yes freely given over a thing beloved, and he did not let go of her hand, and he was not, either of them was not, ever again alone. They were married the next spring, when the goose could be burned out of doors and the moor was green, in a rite far smaller than the coronation and far larger in the only ways that counted to the two of them, with the sworn houses kept politely at the edges and the family at the center where it belonged. There were no thrones at the wedding and no crowns, they had had enough of those under the hill. There was a roof after the old roof behind the eastern gable, where a godfather had once held a baby up to the cold sky and taught him that a black star is a promise he makes about who he is going to be, and there was the porridge in the morning, 3 at the stove and a stool kept empty. And there was Sirius, who cried through the whole of it and pretended it was the wind, and Andromeda made the porridge that morning with 3 at the stove now, and a 4th stool kept empty always for the ones who got them there. They were good rulers, which the histories would record and which mattered less in the end than the small things the histories never hold. They kept the porridge. They kept the roof. The king and queen of a whole kingdom climbed up onto the lid behind the eastern gable on every clear night they could steal from the business of a crown, and named the stars and found siphon in the east and spike overhead, and taught them in time to their children, every black gets a star, and you name it for the promise you make about who you are going to be. They kept the 4th stool empty. Once, years into the reign, a foreign ambassador of great importance came to dine and reached, not knowing, to move the empty stool aside to make room for his own retinue. And the king of Albion, who had faced down a dark lord without raising his voice, said one quiet word that stopped the ambassador's hand in the air, and explained gently over the meal who the stool was for, and the ambassador went home and told his own court that the sovereigns of Britain were ruled under their crowns by their dead. By the ones who had got them there, and that this was the most reassuring thing he had ever seen in a throne room, because a king who keeps a chair for the people he owes is a king who remembers the rent. They walked the wards at dusk, the held wards now, the woken country, and felt the land lean toward them the way it had leaned toward a baby in a cottage by the sea, and never once forgot, either of them, on any day of the long reign, that the crown was a debt and never a theft, that they wore it by the grace of people who could starve, and that they owed the rent every single morning. Sirius lived to be very old and very loud and entirely insufferable about having been right, and he told the story of the night he chose a screaming baby over revenge to anyone who would sit still for it, and the story got better and less accurate every year, and no one ever corrected him because the heart of it was true and the heart of it was the whole point. Andromeda kept the mornings. Tonks rose to lead the oars of a sovereign land and wore her hair every color there was. And the House of Black, which had spent 900 years keeping a faith the world called a children's tale, and turned cruel in the keeping and nearly damned itself, and was redeemed at the last by a roguish lord who learned how to love a child and a fierce old woman who never stopped, took its place in the held kingdom not as the keepers of a buried throne anymore, but as the family of the two who sat it, which was all it had ever, under all the darkness, wanted to be. And the king and queen of Albion ruled a held and quiet land for a long time, and they ruled it the way a dying lord had once told a 6-year-old to, as a debt and never a theft, paying the rent every day to the people who could starve, and they were equals to the end of their days, two that looked like one, and they never, not once in all the long bright reign that followed, left the other in the dark. Chapter 7 End.